those words, as close as possible, have been stripped out. Why? Now it's said we want as close as possible. Now it's said there are all sorts of assurances. But between the text as it was under the previous Prime Minister and the text before us today, the words that we want a trading relationship on goods that's as close as possible, those words have been taken out, and that's not an accident. I will give way.
Thank you for giving way. At the heart of this is a question of destination, not an abstract of moving on today, but the impact of a deal on everyday life in towns like mine. So stop selling the sell-out deal to us as if this is the decision today. For all the talk of a deal, of Norway plus, of Canada plus, the government presents us with Britain minus. Minus protections, minus opportunities, minus prospects. If you're confident in the deal, the government should put it to a final say. Now the deal is through the gate, and people that know more than we did have a say as to whether or not this is what they want. Does my honourable friend agree that a final say is the only way through this mess?
I do agree, but I really want to press this point because, as I say, this isn't just about getting a deal over the line. That's not the end of it. It's what we're getting over the line and what it means for our country. And I invite the Secretary of State to intervene on me. Why were the words, as close as possible, taken out of the text? If the aspiration of the government is to be as close as possible, why take the words out? It's nothing. Let's try... I'll give way in just a moment. Again, going through that exercise of laying the two texts aside alongside each other, the words about alignment are all but gone. A deliberate decision has been taken to take out the aspiration of as close as possible trading relationship, and a deliberate decision has been taken to take out all the words about alignment. That is not an accident. That is not a typo. That is a deeply political decision that tells you everything about the direction of travel under this deal. I give way.
My right honourable learned friend for giving way. And doesn't that go precisely to the heart of why those of us on this side will not be able to vote for this deal? Because we are hearing from our colleagues in the trade union movement who represent millions of workers, including those who work in manufacturing, and they are saying that this deal will be damaging for the future of jobs and livelihoods.
Not the exciting part of the stream, this is the working part of the stream. I am trying to keep up with everything going on. I'm keeping the spreadsheet up to date.
Working people's rights.
I'm grateful for that intervention. I'll make one more point and then I will give way. I'll just make one more point and then I'll give way, if you don't mind, because I just want to reinforce this and then I'll pause. Because not only is the aspiration for as close as possible taken out, references to alignment taken out, the new text, of course, removes the backstop as the basis of the future relationship. So not the backstop in its own right, but as the basis for the future relationship. And that's very important, because it means that the starting point for the next stage is a baseline FTA, with no safety net for workplace rights, consumer rights and environmental standards. They've gone from the binding legal withdrawal agreement altogether. They're found, and I'll come back to them, in the political declaration. So they're out of the binding and into the political direction. I said I'd give way. No, I'll give way.
Very grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way. Whilst we listen to his confession entitled "Why I Wish I Voted for the Previous Deal," could he just share with the House what in actual fact his honest assessment is? That unless a deal said we will remain within the European Union and there will be no changes, he will find false tests and artificially high hurdles in order to preclude him voting for anything, which does not mean we ignore the referendum result.
That's just nonsense. Let me just answer it directly. I have stood at this dispatch box and pressed amendments on the customs union time and time and time again. And members on that side have voted against it. We have put forward a basis of a deal, and we voted for it on this side of the House. So that intervention is just nonsense. So, I will, in just a minute, I will make some progress and then I will give way on both sides. It's obvious where this ends. It either ends with an FTA which significantly weakens rights, standards and protections, or it ends in no deal and WTO terms at the end of the transition. I said I'll give way here, and I will give way across.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for focusing attention on manufacturing. Does he believe, is his assessment, that this deal would lead to new rules of origin checks and other red tape on UK manufacturers exporting to the EU?
Yes, and anybody who's read the text knows it, because it's absolutely clear there will have to be those checks. And let me make one broader point that was made to be by manufacturers themselves. So this is not me speaking, it's what they have said to me. I won't name the company, one of our major motor manufacturers said to me, we don't think we would ever be able to take advantage of any new trade agreement because we could never prove that 50% of our components come from the UK. And that's one of the rules. And that was their concern to me. They didn't... I'll make this point because it's a really powerful point, and if people have not grasped this, then they don't know what they're voting for. They said to me, our components come from across the EU, and at the moment, we can show that 50% of them satisfy the rule to take advantage of the trade agreements that the EU has struck. Their position is they could never satisfy that requirement if the area is shrunk to the UK, and therefore their point to me was not that they're against new trade agreements. Businesses aren't. But they said they will not be able to take advantage of them. That's what they said to me. I said I'd give way, and I will.
Very grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way. The thing that puzzles me is I hear him setting out strong objections to the strategy this government has pursued. And yet, had the Labour Party agreed to hold a general election when it was first mooted, that election would be over by now, and if they'd persuaded the country, there would currently be a Labour Prime Minister at the dispatch box. So what is it about the Labour Party's position that they're not willing to put it to the country?
I think I said this in the debate last week, but I'll say it again. I'm not going to vote for a general election until I know no deal is off the table and we've got an extension. It's as simple as that. I will give way.
I'm very grateful to the Shadow Secretary of State for giving way. I have really agonised this week over whether to support this deal, and it's been profoundly difficult.
Steady on.
But does he share my concern with regard to Northern Ireland, that by disturbing the careful balance within the Good Friday Agreement between the two communities, we run the risk of inflaming unionist opinion in potentially a very dangerous way, just in a sense, as the Honourable Member for Strangford made clear in his intervention?
I am concerned about the position in Northern Ireland, and the Secretary of State quoted me on this earlier. It's true that I and the Labour Party had reservations about the backstop. I'm not sure there are many people who didn't have reservations about the backstop. But on analysis, we thought it was right for Northern Ireland, and therefore we focused our attention on the political declaration. I criticised it. I said what I thought was wrong with it. I was critical, for example, of the fact that it didn't hardwire dynamic alignment of workplace rights. But ultimately, we thought that upholding the Good Friday Agreement was more important and more significant. And I will also say this, because, again, it's very important to read the small print. Whilst it is true that the current deal says that Northern Ireland remains, as it were, in the UK's customs territory, it goes on to explain that for goods going into Northern Ireland, the only ones that escape going effectively into the EU's customs unions are those that are no risk of going beyond Northern Ireland and are not going into manufacturing. And so the volume of goods that cross the border that truly are treated as if Northern Ireland is in the customs union is only that small category, and the burden is on the person who's exporting to prove that.
Okay, I need to
And
go back and listen
me,
to Star Wars.
I'm sorry, the Secretary of State or anybody explain to me how that operates without very careful and extensive. I am concerned about the position in Northern Ireland, and the Secretary of State quoted me on this earlier. It's true that I and the Labour Party had reservations about the backstop. I'm not sure there are many people who didn't have reservations about the backstop. But on analysis, we thought it was right for Northern Ireland, and therefore we focused our attention on the political declaration. I criticised it. I said what I thought was wrong with it. I was critical, for example, of the fact that it didn't hardwire dynamic alignment of workplace rights. But ultimately, we thought that upholding the Good Friday Agreement was more important and more significant. And I will also say this, because, again, it's very important to read the small print. Whilst it is true that the current deal says that Northern Ireland remains, as it were, in the UK's customs territory, it goes on to explain that for goods going into Northern Ireland, the only ones that escape going effectively into the EU's customs unions are those that are at no risk of going beyond Northern Ireland and are not going into manufacturing. And so the volume of goods that cross the border that truly are treated as if Northern Ireland is in the customs union is only that small category, and the burden is on the person who's exporting to prove that. And you explain to me, I'm sorry, the Secretary of State or any... I am concerned about the position. It's very important to read the small print. Whilst it is true that the current deal says that Northern Ireland remains, as it were, in the UK's customs territory, it goes on to explain that for goods going into Northern Ireland, the only ones that escape going effectively into the EU's customs unions are those that are at no risk of going beyond Northern Ireland and are not going into manufacturing. And so the volume of goods that cross the border that truly are treated as if Northern Ireland is in the customs union is only that small category, and the burden is on the person who's exporting to prove that. And you explained...
Let's head back to
Northern Ireland. And there's no getting away from that. This argument the Prime Minister earlier tried to deploy, that he's not putting a border in the Irish Sea, is just wrong. It is absolutely wrong. Any goods that don't fall within that restricted category of being proven that they're not going any further than Northern Ireland and that they're not going into manufacturing are going to be subject to checks, because that is the test written into the deal. I'll give way once more, and then I'm going to make some progress.
I thank my right honourable and learned friend for giving way. Ultimately, the bottom line is, what is the future of people's livelihoods? Never mind what your emotional passions are about being in the European Union or not. What are the implications for workers and their jobs? Ford left Bridgend. 1,700 jobs, 12,000 jobs across the South Wales economy because they were worried about a no-deal Brexit. I have looked at this bill, and there is a real risk that this is the end of just-in-time manufacturing in the whole of the UK. Does my right honourable friend agree?
I do agree, and I am deeply concerned, because, as I say, I am proud of the manufacturing base that we have got and the revival it's gone through. I'm going to make some progress. I've taken a lot of... I will take some more later on. I'm going to make some progress. Mr. Speaker, because it's very important that we work through not just the technicalities, but also where this leads us politically, because this is about the direction of travel for our country. If we go to a bare FTA, and that's what it would mean, the government's own estimates show that that's a loss of about 6.7% growth in GDP over 15 years. And every region and nation will be poorer for it. The Prime Minister's letter to President Tusk of the 19th of August made it clear that from the government's point of view, from his point of view, the point of our exit is to allow the UK to diverge from the rights and standards of the EU. And let's nail this one. You don't need that if you want to go up and have better standards. You don't have to break the rule to bring in better standards. You can do that under the existing rule. So anybody who wants to change the rule is not doing it to have the freedom to bring in better standards, because you don't need to change the rule for that. The only reason you need to diverge is if you want to go down. I will take some interventions. I will finish this point and then I will take intervention. I will in a moment. I'm just going to finish this point of it. And that's why, on this question of divergence, it's very important to focus on the level playing field protections, because, as I say, they're out of what was legally binding into the political declaration and only apply in full until the end of the transition period, 2020. And it's obvious where the government is going. They want a licence to deregulate and to diverge. And I know they will disavow that. And I know they want the deal through. And they will say never. Of course not. But it's obvious where it leads. Because once you've diverged, once you've moved out of alignment with the EU, trade becomes more difficult. I will just finish the point. Trade becomes more difficult, and the EU is not seen any longer as our priority in trade, and the gaze goes elsewhere to make up. I'll finish this point, if I may. I will finish this point, because once you've moved out of alignment, you don't move back. And the further you move out, the less easy it is to trade with the EU 27. And once you've done that, you've broken the economic model we've been operating for decades. And once you've done that, you look elsewhere. And once you've done that, you look across to the United States. I will finish this point, and then I'll give way. The gaze goes across to the US, and that's a different economic model. It's not just another country, it's a different economic model, a deregulated model. In the US, 10 days is the holiday entitlement. Many, many contracts at work are called contracts at will. Hugely powerful corporate bodies have far more power than the workforce. So this is a political direction of travel, not a technical decision on the EU, that takes us to a different economic model, one of deregulation, one of low standards, one where the balance between the workforce and corporate bodies gets far worse than it is now. I'll give way.
My honourable friend for giving way, would he agree that what this is a project, an ideology for the right and by the hard right? That's what we're looking at.
That's right.
And this does not get Brexit done. What we should be doing now is looking forward for the future of our children. Isn't it right that only by putting this back to the people and listening to all those people, the hundreds and thousands who are marching out there today, listening to those young people and giving them a say on their future?
I agree with the tenor of what was said. I will give way.
He talks about workers' rights. The EU entitlement for holiday pay is 4 weeks. In the UK, it's 5.6 weeks. If we wanted to reduce that entitlement and to reduce standards, why would we have done that already?
Well, because Parliament... Because that isn't something that the Labour Party opposite parties would never countenance, and I don't think the government would countenance. The point is a very...
Order! Order! Mr. Hughes, you are a most eccentric denizen of the House. The Shadow Secretary of State for Brexit is not conducting a private conversation with you. Calm yourself. Sakir Starmer.
Thank you. I'll give way.
Grateful to my right honourable friend, because the Conservative Party has luxuriated in telling us that the Ben Act undermined our negotiations by forcing them into no deal, just preventing no deal from being on the table if we left on the 31st of October. But the Prime Minister, in his own words, has said he's negotiated a great deal with that restriction in place. So what possible argument can they have for not agreeing that we cannot leave at the end of the next phase of negotiations with no deal at the end of 2020? Why would they not accept that restriction, given that they negotiated what the Prime Minister calls a great deal?
Well, I'm grateful for that, and I've never accepted the proposition that by ensuring the country against no deal, that undermines the negotiations. And I remind the House that in the negotiating window that ended on the 29th of March, at no point in that 2 years did this House take no deal off the table. Therefore, the entire negotiations were carried out with the risk of no deal. The previous Prime Minister brought back a deal, and half her own side wouldn't vote for it. I will give way.
I'm obviously very grateful to the right honourable gentleman, and he's been very generous with his interventions. But can I just take him back to the very philosophical and logical argument that he is now trying to make? It seems to me that from the dispatch box on that side, the argument is that they have to have the European Union to protect them on workers' rights, because there is almost likely to be a permanent Conservative government that will threaten those workers' rights. Where does that exist, that the Labour Party doesn't have the courage to say they would fight an election and they would make the case for stronger workers' rights and win that election, in which case that's democracy in action rather than somebody else protecting it?
Well, of course we would. But the point is this. The point is this, and it is not being answered by any of these interventions. Since the current rule allows you to have higher standards, why do you write into the deal you want to diverge?
My honourable friend for giving way. When we were in government, the Labour government did legislate to go beyond European minima many times, including granting 6 million workers an extra 8 days paid leave. The point is, much of the time we were doing that, it was being vociferously opposed, and particularly by the Prime Minister, who built his journalistic career on attacking these kinds of measures.
Exactly.
The point he is making is correct, is that this is not just about the legislation that we pass here. It is about the common rule book that gives us market access across the European Union. And the Prime Minister cannot promise a deregulatory future to the ERG and a regulatory future to the Labour Party.
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention, which very carefully and ably makes the point. I'm going to make some progress. I have given away many, many times, because I'm just going to make some progress, then I will give way again. I have given way a number of times. So, of the two possible outcomes, one is this deregulated free trade agreement, which in the end, whatever people say, will drive us away from the European economic model towards a different economic model. And we will look back on this, as a turning point in our history of much greater significance than whether this deal technically gets over the line tonight. But the other possible outcome is this, and I do want to address it, and it's been put to me in interventions. It's that there's no deal at the end of the transition period. And this has to be significantly addressed, because I know some colleagues are tempted to vote for the deal because they believe it prevents or removes the possibility of crashing out on WTO terms. It does not. Under the previous deal, if the future relationship was not ready by the end of transition, the backstop kicked in. That prevented WTO terms. That's gone. This is a trapdoor to no deal. And I will quote the Honourable Member for Basildon and Billericay, and I hope I get it accurately, and if I don't, he'll correct me. But as I understood what he said, and I've got it in quotes, the reason I'm inclined to vote for this deal is very simple. If trade talks are not successful, then we could leave on no-deal terms. And that's stark. It's stark. Oh, I will, yes, I said I would.
He is right with the quote, but what he has done has been... He has been very selective and taken it out of context, but because had he continued, I then made the point that it is commercial reality that by leaving no deal on the table in any negotiations, it actually makes more likely a good and fair trade deal. Yeah, and that is something I and the vast majority of colleagues in this place actually want. We want an FTA agreed with the EU by December 2020, and my firm belief is, and I'm not alone here, is that by actually scrapping the backstop, the previous one, we stand more chance of achieving it.
The honourable gentleman to put his full quote in the library for the delectation of colleagues. Sir Keir Starmer.
Well, I am genuinely grateful, and that's why I wanted to take the intervention. But the fact remains that he's right when he says if the trade deals are not successful, then we could leave on no-deal terms. And let's just explore, Mr. Speaker, before we rush into the lobbies, what that actually means. Because the decision on extending transition under this deal needs to be taken by the end of July next year. That's 8 months away. It's very hard to see how any government could negotiate a completed future relationship within such a short time frame, and particularly one which wants to diverge. The Prime Minister brushed this away earlier by saying, well, we're aligned. Well, that's true. And if you wanted to stay aligned, you could probably do a trade deal a lot more quickly. But this Prime Minister and this government wants to diverge. And so the idea that this does not lead to a no-deal Brexit is wrong, and nobody should vote for this deal on the basis that it is the way to ensure that we don't leave at the end of 2020 on WTO terms. I'm going to make a little bit more progress, then I will give way. Now, today, the Prime Minister dangles prospects of workers' rights and indicates amendments he might be inclined to take down the line. Promises, promises. And I know these are really important issues for I will make this point and then I'll give way. I know how important these issues are to many members on this side, particularly the question of workplace rights, environmental rights and consumer standards. I remind all members of this House that not a single trade union supports this deal. And I urge everyone in the House to reflect on the likelihood of this Prime Minister keeping his promises. This has been made, this is a point that's been made, but I'm going to make it again. Last November, the now Prime Minister told the DUP conference in terms regulatory checks and even customs controls between Great Britain and Northern Ireland would be damaging to the fabric of the Union, and he went on to say no British Conservative government could or should sign up to any such arrangement. His words. What does this deal do? It puts checks and controls between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. It creates a customs border in the Irish Sea. It does precisely what the Prime Minister told the DUP last November he would not do. Typical of this Prime Minister. So those that are considering today putting their trust in this Prime Minister need to reflect on how he's treated his supply and confidence partners. Promise, then burn. And I ask how anybody could trust any promise he is now making. I can give way.
My honourable friend for giving way. This deal not only rules out the customs union, it also rules out a single market relationship, which affects service sector jobs alongside the manufacturing jobs. And as he said, it is a bonfire. It's going to be a bonfire on labour standards and environmental standards. Does he agree with me that this is a Trojan horse for no-deal Brexit? And that is why, on this side of the House, our colleagues must vote it down, and others who believe in the national interest must vote it down.
Yes. I agree completely. I said I'd give way here, and I will, and then I'll give way behind me. Yeah.
grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for giving way. He will have heard the Prime Minister make a commitment to me and to this House that he would legislate, if necessary, to ensure that workers' rights in this country could not be inferior from those in the European Union. So to his question of trust and confidence, if such legislation were pursued in parallel with the Withdrawal Agreement Bill, or in the Withdrawal Agreement Bill, so that the two could be decided together, surely that would give the Right Honourable Gentleman the confidence that he requires.
I'm grateful for that intervention. And the point is this. For a Prime Minister who said no British Conservative government could or should sign up to any such arrangement, to now go and sign up to it, is exactly why we shouldn't trust it. It's why we should support Amendment A. Let me just, it's a very important intervention, and I take it seriously. That is why Amendment A is so important, because that gives this House the opportunity to know what precisely the commitment is and what words are going to go into the legislation. What I'm not prepared to do, I'm afraid, and what I think the vast majority on this side of the House are not prepared to do, is take the Prime Minister's word. There is more than enough evidence that his word doesn't mean anything and cannot be trusted. I said I'd give way here.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. I was one of those that worked in industry in Coventry during the period of the Thatcher government, and as my honourable friend will know, like his father, we've seen thousands of jobs every week lost in the motor car industry. Now, big companies like Jaguar Land Rover and company are very, very worried about the future of the industry, bearing in mind they've got certain things to prove, and if they don't prove it, they'll have to pay tariffs on that, and that can affect jobs and so forth. But the last point I'd want to make is, if anybody knows why we're suspicious about any government in relation to trade union rights, you've only got to look at this government under the previous Prime Minister's trade union bill, and you'll see what exactly they've got in mind.
Well, I am grateful for that intervention. It just reinforces the point that manufacturing, having been on its knees, and now having revived, at least in part in the way it has, why anybody, whichever way they voted, would want to take an axe to it, I will never understand. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to make some progress, then I'll give way again. I've mentioned, I'm just going to make some, I've given way so much, I will give way again. I do just need to make some progress so that others can get in. I want to turn briefly to Amendment A, in the name of the Right Honourable Member for West Dorset. And I want to thank him and his colleagues across the House for the cross-party work they've done in recent months, and this amendment is in that spirit. It's genuinely cross-party. It makes clear that this House will not be bounced into supporting what is a very bad deal without a proper chance to scrutinise it. It would allow the House to make sure the legal text is acceptable, and to provide time to seek changes through the passage of the implementing legislation. And it would ensure that the Benn Act can be applied. And can I say this? It doesn't cause delay, because that exercise is going to have to be gone through anyway. So it's not to vote to delay, it's a vote to get on with looking at the next stage, a stage which is going to have to look at. What it does provide is an insurance policy against signing up to a deal that isn't what it seems, with the risk of a no-deal Brexit to boot. Mr. Speaker, the deal before this House is a thoroughly bad deal, a bad deal for jobs, rights and living standards, a bad deal for the future direction of the country. It will put us on a path to an entirely different economy and society, one of deregulation and divergence. It will end either in a bare-bones free trade agreement or no deal in 8 months. It stands against everything the labour and trade movement stands for.
Oh, don't need people in a rather juvenile fashion calling out behind you. The Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman will give way if and when he wants to give way, as was true of the Secretary of State, and notwithstanding the notably generous-spirited instincts of the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Member for Surrey Heath, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, I'm not aware that the Shadow Brexit Secretary has asked the Right Honourable Gentleman to be his mentor. Sir Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, If we pass this deal today, it will be a long way back for the communities we represent, and I urge all members to reject it.
Thank you. To move Amendment A, I call the Right Honourable Gentleman, Member for West Dorset, Sir Oliver Letwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to move the amendment which is in my name and that of many other honourable and right honourable members. I don't need to detain the House for long. The purpose of the amendment, as has been said in several interventions and speeches, is to keep in place the insurance policy provided by the Benn Act, which prevents us from crashing out automatically if there is no deal in place by the 31st of October. When the Prime Minister brings his implementing legislation to this House next week, I will vote for it. But we all know that the votes on that legislation throughout its passage will be tight. The Prime Minister has a strategy. I fully accept that, and I accept that it is rational in its own terms. It is that he wants to be able to say to any waverers, it's my deal or no deal, vote for the implementing legislation, or we crash out. Now, I understand that strategy, but we can't be sure that such a threat from the Prime Minister would work. And I won't, if you'll forgive me, because I'm going to be so brief that I won't take any interventions. We can't be sure that such a threat from the Prime Minister would work, and I, despite my support for the Prime Minister's deal, do not believe that it's responsible to put the nation at risk by making that threat. So I'm moving this amendment, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that whichever way any future votes may go, today or next week or the week after, we can be secure in the knowledge that the UK will have requested an extension tonight, which, if granted, can be used if and to the extent necessary, and only the extent necessary, to prevent a no-deal exit.
The question is that Amendment A be made, and I'm grateful to the Right Honourable and Right Honourable Gentleman for moving his amendment. We come now to Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a considerable pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Member for West Dorset. Let me commend him for his amendment and for his contribution this afternoon. Mr. Speaker, an equal partner within the Union, a nation within the European Union. The broken promises of 2014 from this government and the Better Together campaign could not be more stark than they are today. Scotland has been totally and utterly shafted by this Prime Minister and this Tory government. Scotland is the only part of the United Kingdom where our democratic rights are not being respected. England voted leave, Wales voted leave, and Northern Ireland gets to remain in the EU single market and customs union, a special arrangement to protect its interest in people. But Scotland has been ignored. Scotland has been dragged out of the European Union against its will. Mr. Speaker, 62% of Scotland voted to remain. Yet this Tory government and this Brexit fanatic Prime Minister has ignored Scotland's wishes and the interest by bringing forward a deal that will weaken our economy. Mr. Speaker, the Scottish National Party categorically reject this appalling Brexit deal, and we will vote it down today. Not only would this deal be devastating for Scotland, dragging us out of the European Union, the single market and the customs union against our will, it is clear that a right-wing Brexiteer have been assured by senior Tory government ministers that backing this deal could lead to a no-deal crash-out if trade talks fail next year. Mr. Speaker, anyone tempted to vote for this deal today needs to be warned that this is a blank cheque to the Vote Leave campaign, who are now running the Tory government to crash all of us out of the European Union on a no-deal basis at the end of transition next year. the Prime Minister's deal isn't a deal at all. It's the gateway to a no-deal Brexit, taking us off the cliff edge not at the end of October, but at the end of 2020. Let me be clear. Any Brexit would have disastrous implications for Scotland's economy.
They don't care.
Mr. I'll be here.
Would he agree with me that whilst agreeing with the member for Dorset's amendment and his idea that we'll stop no deal, what we have in front of us is no guarantee from the Prime Minister that he will avoid crashing out after the transition period,
I'm pulling up the place names that made it for the initial
take longer than a year
just
to
by
put
checking
together.
them
So
where
isn't
they
this
are in the
really
alphabetical
a
order.
death row deal? We've got a year and we'll be crashing out,
Right,
and it's our
okay.
duty to vote against it.
I'm most grateful, because the Prime Minister was given the opportunity to rule that out. The Secretary of State was given the opportunity to rule that out, and neither did. And I would say to colleagues right across this House, take note of that. Take note, anyone that's tempted to vote for this deal today, because there is a very real risk that a no-deal Brexit takes place by the back door. Mr. Speaker, I will make some progress. I know that many colleagues wish to speak. The viability of our economic future would be brought into question because of the damage it would do to investment, to population growth and our key exports. All Brexit assessments show that the United Kingdom and that Scotland will be poorer no matter how we leave the European Union.
Correct.
And if those on government benches disagree, why have they not done an economic impact assessment on their deal? How are members of Parliament supposed to debate and decide on the details of this deal when the government hasn't provided a detailed analysis? It absolutely beggars belief that something so fundamental to all our citizens' futures, and yet there is no economic impact assessment.
Thank the honourable gentleman, for giving way, and he does appreciate that we come from this from very different perspectives. However, today I do believe we should be united on this issue. This is not a good deal for Northern Ireland. I would plead with him not to try and suggest that what would be a bad deal for Northern Ireland should then be a good deal for the people of Scotland. If what was being applied today to the people of Scotland, I would be voting against it for his sake and for his people's sake, and that's why I'm encouraging him to vote against it for our sake.
Well, we will certainly vote against it because I don't believe this is a good deal, period. But, Mr. Speaker, how did the Prime Minister even signal up to a deal without understanding the impact on the economy? What a dereliction of duty. Mr. Speaker, the truth is, because the Prime Minister isn't concerned with the economy, the Prime Minister isn't concerned with the facts. The Brexiteers don't care about facts during the referendum campaign, and it looks as if they're doing the same now. The truth must hurt, because, Mr. Speaker, the truth is this. Every version of Brexit is going to leave us worse.
Correct.
It would continue to damage our relationship with the European Union, but it doesn't grant us much scope to develop relations with other countries. It is also clear that the heightened economic uncertainty has been forecast to reduce business investment by £1 billion in 2019, damaging our economy and leaving Scotland poorer.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. I'm mindful of words. What a fool I was, only a puppet. And so was Ulster, and so was Ireland in the political game that was to get the Conservative Party into power. Now, while the DUP may be choking in the words of Carson, I am sure that he, as a member and a leader of our political party, will remind the government that Scotland will not be duped a second time.
My honourable friend is correct. And you know what I say to the Conservatives and those that are here for now from Scotland, that if this deal goes through, if this has the impact on Scotland and creates a competitive disadvantage, then it's increasingly clear, and we can see it from the messages that are coming from us, even today, from people that voted no in our referendum in 2014. They are making it very clear that they want Scotland's right to choose. And I make this guarantee to you, Mr. Speaker, that Scotland will become an independent nation, and an independent nation in short order.
People to him for giving way. I think the House is faced with an impossible choice. This is like being asked to buy a house just based on the estate agent details designed to sell it, with no chance to look inside it or see any kind of contract on it. We spend about 2 months scrutinising and debating the finance bill, and that is just for a one-year budget for Britain. Isn't it absolutely ridiculous that we can't even see the bill, let alone the economic impact, before we're allowed to take a decision?
Absolutely, and heaven knows what the term of the mortgage might be. Let me make it clear, I certainly won't be buying any house from this Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, Brexit in any form will damage the branding, reputation and standing of Scottish produce. Our civil society, its regulatory alignment to key markets, its commercial and political relationships abroad, and even recognition of skills and qualifications. Scotland relies on the skills and labour that the EU offers for its economic growth. Brexit will only serve to weaken our access to a vital labour market, and considering that Scotland's native population is declining, we need more migration to our country, not less.
To the right honourable gentleman for finally giving way, but what he is not telling the House is that every major business group in Scotland is encouraging this House to support this deal today. Chambers of Commerce, the CBI, the Federation of Small Businesses, the NFUS, the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, all of them pleading with us to bring uncertainty to an end and to vote for this deal. Don't listen to the SNP. They are not Scotland.
Order! Order! We're grateful to the honourable gentleman member for Stirling. I remind the House that interventions must be brief and we need to expedite progress. Subtle hint. Mr Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And you know, it is illuminating to hear such voices in this House, because I'm afraid the harsh reality is that many business organisations, many industry organisations in Scotland see the impact, and not just in Scotland, throughout the UK. The British Chamber of Commerce, the National Farmers Union, the Food and Beverage Association, the Timber Trade Federation have all talked about the negative impact of this deal, but you never get the truth from the Scottish Conservatives. Mr. Speaker, no, I'm going to make progress because I'm aware that other colleagues wish to speak.
Well done, Ian.
Mr. Speaker, it didn't have to be like this. If the Prime Minister had any interest in the people of Scotland, he would have engaged with our Scottish Government. Yep. From the very beginning, the Scottish Government sought to compromise. We did this by offering up Scotland's place in Europe, a compromise position for all of the United Kingdom and for Scotland to remain in the single market and the customs union. And, you know, I have to tell you that we had no engagement with the UK Government over these papers. But I can say this to you. When I went to see Michel Barnier, he had read every page of that document. That's the difference between the attitude of our friends and colleagues in Europe and the disdain that our Scottish Government gets from Westminster. Our plan was dismissed out of hand, and then followed by years of the UK Government ignoring Scotland, ignoring our Parliament. Mr. Speaker, with Northern Ireland getting access to the single market and the customs union, it is clear that the Prime Minister is willing to put trust in the people of Northern Ireland to manage its relationship. So it's inexplicable that he won't trust the people of Scotland, who also voted overwhelmingly to remain in the European Union. Absolutely. This offer gives Northern Ireland a competitive advantage over Scotland. And whilst we respect and understand the unique circumstances of Northern Ireland, I want to be clear. Everyone in the SNP wants to see the continuation of peace and stability. But the proposal in this deal is, in effect, being kept in the single market and the customs union as a consequence. That was our compromise position, and the UK government completely ignored us, ignored Scotland. The Prime Minister has shown the people of Scotland total contempt. A Prime Minister who has no mandate from Scotland, yet he seeks to impose his Brexit against our democratically expressed will, silences the wishes of our people and weakening our economy. This Prime Minister and his Brexit fan club in number 10 don't care about Scotland. They're obsessed with only one thing: winning and delivering their Brexit fantasy at any cost. Mr. Speaker, the dishonesty and lies of the... Well, you know, I hear the ministers shouting from the front bench. Not true. Where was the engagement with the Scottish Government of our place in Europe? It simply didn't happen. It was absolutely, completely true. He can shake his head because he doesn't like the reality. Mr. Speaker, the dishonesty and the lies of Vote Leave brought the country to vote for Brexit in the first place. And this should be something...
Resume your seat. As far as I'm aware, the Right Honourable Gentleman is not currently giving way. And so the order! And so the Chancellor that he shouldn't stand there portentously as though he has an absolute right to intervene. It might be courteous to allow him to do so, but such an allowance has not yet been made. Mr. Ian Blackford.
I'm afraid today, Mr. Speaker, this House will be listening to our voices, and perhaps the Right Honourable Gentleman might catch your eye later on. Mr. Speaker, the dishonesty and lies of Vote Leave brought this country to vote for Brexit in the first place. And this would be something that the Prime Minister and many in his cabinet should be ashamed of. They have torn their country, their parliament, their own party apart. Mr. Speaker, this is the beginning of the end of their precious union and their distorted Etonian vision for society. Scotland will not be ignored anymore. The deal must be stopped and binned today. Whether this deal passes today or not, the government needs an extension. This deal is devastating for Scotland. We will not vote for it, and we call for the extension period to be used for an election, so that we can get rid of this rotten Tory government out of Downing Street. The Scottish National Party are here to do our job, to stand stronger for Scotland. Those across this House who ever want to lay claim to representing the voices and the interests of the people of Scotland, you cannot support this deal. You cannot inflict economic and social harm on our society. Myth after myth from the Prime Minister and his cronies, but the facts are clear. The European Union accounts for 56% of the UK's exports and 65% of imports, either through the EU directly or through other countries where the EU has trade arrangements with. The direct value of EU trade is over triple the value of US trade. The Brexit Secretary even said that the EU was the UK's most important partner. 100,000 jobs in Scotland at risk. Our fishermen, farmer and crofters, all disadvantaged by this deal. As the Scottish Seafood Association put it, this could switch the lights out for a small exporter. 5 separate certificates all have to be done on October 31st. For a small exporter, that is possibly trying to sell 30 kilos of top quality langoustines to a restaurant in Paris. Switch the lights off. The restaurant owner is going to go and buy his lovely langoustines somewhere else. Not my words, that's from the Scottish Seafood Association. And I hope, Mr. Speaker, that people in Scotland can see the government front bench are laughing. People's livelihoods are at risk, and the government front bench thinks it's funny. You should be utterly, utterly ashamed of yourselves. Mr. Speaker, the Scottish National Party will not stand by and let this government rip our economy and our country's future apart. We are Europeans, and Scotland is a European nation. Members across this House should unite with the SNP and bring this government down. A general election is the best way now to stop this Prime Minister and stop this dangerous Brexit. Mr. Speaker, let me say this. Anyone, any single member here this afternoon who backs the Tory Prime Minister and his cheating Vote Leave campaign by shafting Scotland will never, not ever be forgiven by the people of Scotland. Overnight, we've seen the reports, the rumours and the whispers. Mr. Speaker, is the Labour Party really going to allow their members of Parliament to vote for this catastrophic Brexit deal? Let me remind the Labour Party what the TUC said. This deal would be a disaster for working people. It would hammer the economy, cost jobs and sell workers' rights down the river. The Prime Minister has negotiated even a worse deal than Theresa May. All MPs should vote against it. That's the words of the TUC. So let me ask, why has the Leader of the Opposition not yet guaranteed that all Labour MPs will vote with the Scottish National Party this afternoon against this deal? A deal that would be devastating for Scotland, ripping us out of the EU against our will, terminating our freedom of movement rights, threatening jobs, living standards, our public services and the economy. Is the Leader of the Labour Party really willing to allow any members of his party to write a blank cheque for this Tory Prime Minister to deliver Brexit? Not a single member of the Labour Party should be voting for a deal that delivers a race to the bottom on workers' rights, on environmental standards, and paves the way for dismantling our precious NHS. It would be absolutely staggering that with a no-deal threat on the table, any Labour MP could even think about voting for this toxic deal. Mr. Speaker, Labour must not be the handmaidens of a Tory Brexit, which we know will cost thousands of jobs and harm people's livelihoods. So I appeal to every member of I give you.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way. I wondered if he got a section of his speech from John Landsman. So could I ask the right honourable gentleman, does he agree with me that when it comes to workers' rights, the EU isn't God? The fact is, local authorities up and down the UK have to outsource contracts to the European Union at the detriment of workers in their local communities. We have seen a rise in zero-hour contracts and poor conditions, partly because of that outsourcing. Does he agree with me?
I thank the right honourable lady. We were colleagues together in committee. I'm fond of her, as she knows.
To the right honourable gentleman to face the House so we can all hear. Mr Ian Blackford.
I simply say to my right honourable friend that I would trust the European Union with workers' rights before I would trust... The opposition must stop the excuses and finally act by backing the SNP tonight to reject this damaging deal, secure an extension and call an election so we can bring this Tory government down and stop Brexit. But Mr. Speaker, meanwhile, Scottish Tory MPs are prepared to vote for a deal that they previously pledged that they would not back. Simple irresponsibility and moral cowardice. I say to the Scottish Tories, you are serving the death knell on the Union by voting for this deal. Independence is coming, and we will take our place as a proud European nation. What a shift in time, Mr. Speaker, from what Ruth Davidson said in 2014. No means we stay in. We are members of the European Union. Mr. Speaker, the people of Scotland now know, more than ever, you can never, not ever, trust a Tory. We already know that despite the promise after promise...
Order! We wish to expedite the debate, and the right honourable gentleman must be heard as I think he's approaching his peroration. Mr Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and perhaps if they settle down we can get through this and their voices might be heard. We already know that despite promise after promise made by the Scottish Tories to protect our fishermen, that the backstop loophole in the deal threatens to be potentially devastating for the Scottish fishing sector. Under the proposed deal, it might actually help if you listen rather than trying to shout from a position at the bar. Because this is about the livelihood of fishermen that they falsely claim to protect, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, under the proposed deal, Scottish fish exports to the European Union face being hit by damaging tariffs. Any move which could see Scottish vessels register in Northern Ireland to land their catch there and then have it moved to the Republic for processing to escape those duties would pose a huge danger to Scotland's fishing ports and our widening processing industry. That's the reality of what the Tories are threatening to do to our fishing industry. It would directly threaten thousands of jobs and could make the sector among the most hardest hit by Brexit in the whole of Scotland. Scottish fishing sold out by the Conservatives yet again. That is the stark reality, opposed to the bluster of a UK Tory government which once again treats Scotland as an afterthought. Well, Mr Speaker, we in the SNP, we will not stand for it. I warn members who marched through the lobbies with the government this afternoon that selling Scotland out by backing this deal will be the final nail in the coffin for the Union. Mr Speaker, while the UK drags Scotland out of the EU against our will, while this Tory government downgrades our devolution settlement and destroys our rights, in Scotland the SNP are looking proudly at our record. We are ambitious for our nation. And not this Prime Minister, not the Leader of the Opposition, not any Leader of the Liberal Democrats, not anyone will stand in our way. The Scottish people are sovereign, and they should have the choice to determine their own future. Mr Speaker, this year, Scotland is marking the 20th anniversary of devolution, the establishment of our Scottish Parliament. The first speech that was made in the new Scottish Parliament in May 1999 was by my good friend Winifred Ewing. At the time she made that speech, she was also, of course, the mother of the European Parliament, having served there since 1979. Winnie expressed the hope that the Scottish Parliament would try to follow the more consensual style of the European Parliament and other European parliaments rather than the more confrontational approach that we witnessed again here today in Westminster. And in our actions now, our actions today, we are trying to stay true to that advice. While there remains uncertainty over whether this proposed deal will pass, what is absolutely clear is it would take us out of the European Union, out of the single market, out of the customs union, against the overwhelming democratic will of the people of Scotland. Mr Speaker, Scotland did not vote for Brexit in any form. And unlike others, the SNP will not vote for Brexit in any form. Scotland has been shafted, sidelined, silenced, ignored by this UB government, and it cannot be ignored today. Members, I urge you, do not stand by and allow this Prime Minister to drag us into an economic abyss. Because I warn the House, it is clearer than ever that the best future for Scotland is one as an equal, independent European nation. That is a choice that the SNP is determined to ensure is given to the people of Scotland. And those who vote against Scotland's interests this afternoon will be aware you are ending the Union. Scotland is not for leaving Europe. We will become an independent nation. My message to Europe is leave a light on for Scotland.
Order! A five-minute limit on backbench speeches will have to apply with immediate effect, though I don't anticipate that that limit will last very long. Mrs. Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when I arrived at the House of Commons this morning, I saw the message, "Good day for May." I thought that perhaps consensus had come across the whole of the House and that it had already been decided that this deal would be supported by the House tonight. Unfortunately, my view on that was premature, and I think only premature. But happily for England, of course, it was a reference to Johnny May having scored the first 2 tries in our victory against Australia. I hope the whole House will forgive me if I say that standing here I have a distinct sense of déjà vu.
I know how you feel.
But today's vote is an important... Well, I intend to rebel against all of those who don't want to vote to deliver Brexit. Mr. Speaker, today's vote is important. The eyes of the country, no, actually the eyes of the wider world are upon us today. And every member in this House has a responsibility in the decision that they will take to determine on whether or not they are going to put the national interest first, and not just an ideological or a single issue or a party political interest, but the full wider interests of our
Sorry, I didn't see you come in.
And as we look at
I am
this,
so busy jumping between screens at the moment, it is ridiculous. Yeah, I'm not too bad. This is an incredibly busy stream at the moment. Not from your point of view, I guess, from mine. I am covering Brexit in Parliament.
And it's simple.
I am jumping between what I'm listening to on the TV, which is BBC Parliament, the stream which you can hear, or should it's coming straight from Parliament, if their volume's still on.
They reject results of
and
referendum.
various updates coming in from different Twitter feeds and various live news feeds. So,
we really mean it?
Yeah.
When we voted,
I'm only focusing on what's actually happening in Parliament. If I have tried covering the protests and the march today, I'm doing this by myself. There's no way I can do it all.
Did we really mean it?
Like literally, I am my own research for this.
Yes, we did mean it. Yes, we keep faith with the British people. Yes, we want to deliver Brexit. Because if the right honourable lady will just wait for a minute. Because if this Parliament did not mean it, then it is guilty of the most egregious con trick on the British people. There have been many views across this House. I want to say simply to some of the groups involved. There are those, some of whom believe passionately and have believed for some time, others who've come to this more lately, that there should be a second referendum. I say simply this: you cannot have a second referendum simply because some people don't agree with the result of the first. And I don't like... No, there are many people who want to speak, so I'm going to carry on. I've taken many interventions and questions across this over time. I don't like referenda, but I think that if you have one, you should abide by the result that people have given you. Then there is the Labour Party front bench, and I've heard much from the Labour Party front bench over the last 3 years about the importance of protecting jobs, of protecting manufacturing, of protecting people's livelihoods. If they really meant that, they would have voted for the deal earlier in this. And now is their chance to show whether they really care about people by voting for this deal tonight in this afternoon, I hope, Mr. Speaker, in this House of Commons. And then I say to all of those across this House who say they do not want no deal, I've said it before, I've said it many times, I hope this is the last time I have to say it. If you don't want no deal, you have to vote for a deal. Businesses are crying out for certainty, people want certainty in their lives. Investors want to be able to invest and want the uncertainty to be got rid of. They want to know that this country is moving forward. If you want to deliver a Brexit, if you want to keep faith with the British people, if you want this country to move forward, then vote for the deal today.
Mr. Peter Kyle.
Speaker, and I say with all respect and humility to the former Prime Minister that there will be a lot of people watching this now and listening to her words that will feel very strongly that the only contrick is a Prime Minister who makes a solemn promise to the public that there would be under no circumstances a border down the Irish Sea, and then seeing the same person traipsing through the lobbies to vote precisely for it. So I would expect a little bit more humility from her. Mr. Speaker, all of us who were very participant in the referendum debate noticed one thing. The prospectus for Brexit was a very poorly defined prospectus. It was very difficult to gauge precisely what it would mean for our country. But when the Prime Minister signed the Article 50 treaty, she had the legal right to define Brexit. She came back with this deal, over 500 pages of definition of Brexit. This deal defined it, and for almost a year, the Prime Minister said, and the government said, that this deal respected the will of the people. And now we have a separate deal.
Yes, society is definitely cracking and falling apart.
And this government is saying that this fundamentally different deal
to be fair, these
represents the will of the people.
Sorry, I'm still doing my vocal exercises. So, yeah, to be fair, this is more a result of decades. This is a result of politics stretching back to at least 79. Probably earlier than that. So,
represent the will of the people. And I say,
basically since 79, we've had governments putting into place very divisive stuff.
What people voted
and they're not really dealing with the fallout that came from it, just papering over it, hoping it would go away.
Not ask them based on promises, ask them based on facts, because we have the facts now.
Pointed
The
examples.
compromise that the Honourable Gentleman for Sedgefield and I have been working on is a compromise, because we could be the Remainers who open the door to Brexit.
And
it is about
Toxteth riots as well. I just had a quick shifty at that, and
in Parliament.
Brixton and Toxteth both had inquiries, if I remember right, looking at them, looking at the causes, and changes were made. But not really. I mean, as I said, it's papering over the cracks in the structure that's fundamentally unsound. But then I subscribe to a radical political philosophy rather than centrist. So I would see it like that.
Some people believe in the May deal. Some people want the May deal minus backstop. Some people want a Northern Ireland backstop. Some people want a customs union. Some people want no deal. Some people want a managed no deal. Does he agree with me that that is why whatever deal
as everybody has got about 5 minutes so far to transfer on for their motions.
I'm extremely grateful for a thoughtful intervention. Of course, I agree with him, because I speak as somebody who has voted for 3 separate versions of Brexit. I haven't opposed. Most members of the ERG have voted for Brexit. So the key question is, how do we break the gridlock? How do we get through this impasse? The idea of a referendum based on a deal is a confirmatory referendum. We put the prospectus back to the people and say, is this good enough for you? Exactly the same way that we did in Northern Ireland with the Good Friday peace agreement. I will give way.
Thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. As he knows, back in February 2016, before the referendum, that suggestion was put to the then Prime Minister, who stood at that dispatch box and said that the proposal, the very idea, was absolutely ridiculous. Nobody in this House disputed that then. Where was he?
I was here in the House, and I was working constructively with the members across the House, and I voted for 3 separate versions of Brexit. I have done my bit to try and get across the line in this, but we've got to the point now where so many different people, simply because the prospectus for Brexit wasn't defined at the start of the process, it was only defined at the end of the process, that so many people in this House have a different version of Brexit, that we are irreconcilably divided. Therefore, we have proposed a compromise whereby we would allow the deal to pass through Parliament in return for inviting the public in to say, in a definitive final say, whether they will allow this deal to pass. The public can decide, is this deal good enough for them, for their family, for their community, their jobs, and our country? If it is, then we can leave directly on those terms without any need to return to this place. If it's not, we can remain with the deal we have. Two propositions bound in international treaty and law that are implementable straight away. We gained growing support for this across the House when we pushed it last time. People repeatedly said to us that if the Prime Minister's at the Times deal is defeated, they would want to come and consider this, but they wouldn't want to consider it before any defeat. Well, the problem was that we didn't get the opportunity to press for a vote straight afterwards, but now we do. Because the government is pushing two motions tonight, one on their deal, one on no deal, we will have an opportunity to vote after the House has spoken on the main deal. So to all people who want to support the deal, I say this: focus on the deal, support the deal, but accept one thing. If the deal does not succeed in the first vote tonight, we have to make a choice. And there is a choice on the table that keeps the deal alive, that keeps the deal intact. It is the only way in those circumstances that the deal can proceed forward. And in those circumstances, I hope that people from across the House will decide that the country needs resolution, and there is an option that remains standing that will break the gridlock, that will get Brexit out of Westminster, back into our communities for one definitive final say. We can
Sorry
bring
about
this
that.
nightmare
Mike's back
to an end.
on.
Thank you.
Kenneth Clark!
Mr. Speaker, I hoped I would never be driven in these long debates on Brexit to finally deciding what my opinion is on the choice between no deal and a bad deal. And I regret to say that when my right honourable friend, the previous Prime Minister, put forward the proposition before, I had considerable doubts about her belief that no deal was better than a bad deal. And those doubts have increased. Because what we have before us now is undoubtedly a bad deal. I think it's a very bad deal. I think it's wholly inferior to the deal that was negotiated by my right honourable friend, the former Prime Minister, for which I too voted 3 times, like the honourable member from Brighton. We cannot be accused of taking part in these debates seeking to block Brexit and repudiate the wishes of the British public and all the rubbish which the more fanatic Brexiteers and their followers frequently hail at us. But now the choice is very real. It is a very bad deal for reasons which I won't dilate on, others have. I actually have considerably sympathy with the members from Northern Ireland, the independent unionists, whom I almost always agree with, also the democratic unionists. This is a most truly constitutional position. They're being put in as members of the United Kingdom, and I would very much rather that we didn't have this situation of a border down the Irish Sea, because there's absolutely no doubt there's quite a clear customs and regulatory border being envisaged down the Irish Sea. It has to be said that the effect is to save the all-Irish economy from the near calamity that a total no deal would have resulted in. I have no idea how anybody would have operated a no-deal situation across the border, and I thought these weird propositions of a customs border somewhere in Northern Ireland but not on the border had little or no chance of working. But although the Irish at least have the economic consolation that they will sail on through the transition period as they are now, I'm extremely worried that the purpose of going to negotiate this convoluted arrangement over Ireland was so that the economy of Britain could be taken out of the customs union and the single market straight away. And in fact holds, after the transition period, I think that will have the most damaging effects on our economic future for all the reasons that other people have given in the earlier and lengthy speeches we've had. Now, therefore, it's all to be played for in this transition period. I actually do not believe that a good free trade agreement, a good agreement on security, fighting international crime, agreements on the licensing of medicines, the possible arrangements with the European Medicines Agency, all the things spelt out, are likely to be achieved by the end of next year. The Canada deal, which a lot of Brexiteers like to hold up as a model, took about 9 years before that was put in place. So I do wish that we prepare to contemplate a more realistic timescale. But meanwhile, I think the votes today and the process the next week or two have got to get us through the necessary process to put in place a withdrawal agreement so we have a transition period in which we can have the full negotiations about the ultimate destination. And all my votes in this House personally have been to ensure the calamity of leaving with no deal on the 31st of October or whenever was never allowed to happen. For that reason, I think we should support this deal. I cannot understand the government's resistance to saying that, of course, we should legislate before we abandon the protection of the Benn Act and decide we don't need an extension. The government says, oh, you can take that for granted, the detail, getting the votes. We all know that none of us are sure whether there's a majority for this government at all, for the present deal today. If they can keep it through the whole of the legislation, I shall be very reassured. I'd like to wait to see that they can.
More grateful than ever before to the right honourable and learned gentleman. The 5-minute limit still applies, but the honourable gentleman is the last member to benefit from it. Sammy Wilson.
As a party, we have been supportive all throughout this process of delivering on the referendum result of the British people. We have defied and opposed the procedural chicanery which has gone on in this place, the political machinations which have gone on in this place to try and undermine that. The irony is that today, which should be a day of rejoicing for us when the Prime Minister comes back with a deal, we find that Northern Ireland and Northern Ireland alone will be left within the clutches of the European Union by being de facto members of the customs union and being tied to European regulations. Now, the government has put forward two defences for its position. The first is that there will be no border down the Irish Sea. There is no border down the Irish Sea. But let's look at the facts of this. As a result of the customs arrangements, first of all, every good which is exported from GB to Northern Ireland will be subject to a customs declaration. Movements will be subject to checks. Unless it can be proved that the goods are not going outside Northern Ireland, duty will be paid. Only when you've proved that they aren't going will the duty be paid back. And on top of that, there will be all of the regulations of the European Union imposed in Northern Ireland. Now, if anybody tells me that that does not represent an economic, customs, legal border, hard border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom, I don't know what a hard border looks like then. And furthermore, when it came during debates in this House, I have heard it said that if there were to be an extra camera placed on the border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic, or one additional piece of paper had to be signed, that would represent a break in the Good Friday Agreement, because it would represent a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. So on one hand, you can have all of these checks between Northern Ireland and GB, and it doesn't count as a hard border, but one camera on the border between Northern Ireland and Irish Republic does count as a hard border. And I think that shows how false
The argument has been put forward by the government that they have not accepted a hard border between Northern Ireland. And what's the implication of that? It means that we are, first of all, cut off from the country to which we belong, and secondly, our economic relationships with the biggest market that we have are damaged. The second argument being put forward by the Minister today is this, that, well, you could get out of it. You can vote against it. And that will, I'll give way in a moment to, let me just finish this argument. You can vote against it. But of course, there's a mechanism in Northern Ireland and for dealing with sensitive issues. It's enshrined in an internationally binding agreement. And that mechanism, because of the sensitive nature of politics in Northern Ireland, says that any controversial issue has to be decided by a cross-community vote. That part of the Belfast Agreement, which is so sacrosanct in this House and to those who negotiate it, has now been torn out of the Belfast Agreement, and will give way.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman, and he's making his own powerful argument, which we have heard. Could I ask him, in the limited time available, that he turns his attention and addresses the amendment made by my right honourable friend for Dorset West? Because if he's concerned about a hard border, Mr. Speaker, he must recognise that the door may be opening, if that passes today, for a hard border and no-deal Brexit to emerge.
Well, I mean, first of all, the hard border is there. And, you know, I've made the argument, and I defy anybody to tell me that if you've got to fill in a customs declaration, you've got to have lorries and vans searched at the ports coming into to Northern Ireland, you've got to pay taxes on goods which come from GB, that's not a hard border already. And we will. So, and let me come to this issue of consent, because it's important. Because the Minister dismisses unionist fears by saying you can vote your way out of it. Well, of course, the mechanism for voting our way out of it is laid down by an international treaty. Why is that not going to be adhered to? Because the government and the EU and the Irish government knows that that would be an effective way of Northern Ireland doing the very thing that the Minister has said we'll be able to do. Remove that, and you remove the ability of Northern Ireland to take itself out of this arrangement. And of course, we only get the chance after 4 years. We're put into it without any consent at all.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Would my honourable friend agree with me that in Northern Ireland at the moment, and for the last 1,000 days where we have had no government, there has been a majority, not just a simple majority, a significant majority of parties and people who want to get back to work. We are being held and blackmailed by a minority party, Sinn Féin, and yet this government has defended that minority veto for over 1,000 days, meaning there's no government in Northern Ireland.
Well, of course, that's the irony, that we have to avoid having an assembly because the voting mechanism of the Belfast Agreement must be adhered to. But when it comes to getting out of this arrangement, which has severe consequences for Northern Ireland, the mechanism of the Belfast Agreement doesn't have to be adhered to. Now, again, either we avoid a hard border, or we have a hard border. Either we adhere to the Belfast Agreement, or we don't adhere to the Belfast Agreement. And this agreement that the government has signed turns all of those
sorry,
things
I am really struggling to keep up with everything because I am dipping between everything. I will get to this court as soon as I can.
Who have defended their constituency interests, whether it's the fishing industry in Scotland or in Cornwall, whether it's the industrial worker, the rights of workers in their own constituencies, they will understand why we will not give into this agreement, which we believe does damage to our part of the United Kingdom, and which will lead to the focus of attention away from London towards Dublin. Because don't forget, we'll be tied into an arrangement, where the laws for Northern Ireland will be made in Brussels. The British government will have no input. The Stormont government will have no input. So where does the focus of attention come then for industry and lobby groups?
Sorry about that.
Yeah,
I am jumping
Dublin.
in and out between different things at the moment, making everything a bit tricky.
In relation to the amendment. All I can say
unfortunately,
is
because I've got
we would be failing in our duty.
Parliament
if
on
we
now
do
on two
not
different backgrounds. I'm going to
use
have to sort of
every
like
strategy which is available
tip my
to
headphones
try
back
and
off
get
my ear for the moment.
changes
and
and alterations which will safeguard the interests of the United Kingdom, the interests of our constituents and the interests that we represent.
Order. A 3-minute limit now applies. Chris Grayling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was planning to be brief anyway. I campaigned to leave, Mr. Speaker, but at every stage of the campaign I argued that we should leave on good terms with our friends and neighbours, that we should leave with a deal. I supported the previous Prime Minister in what she sought to achieve. I pay tribute to this Prime Minister for what he has done in bringing forward a deal that after a year of turbulence in this place, when we have not really come near to finding anything a majority in this House can agree on, what is absolutely clear today is that we are much closer than we have been before to something which this Parliament is willing to give its support to. I pay tribute to the Prime Minister for achieving that, and I strongly urge this House to unite behind this agreement. But I specifically, Mr. Speaker, want to talk about the amendment being brought forward by the Right Honourable Member for West Dorset. And I want everyone on all sides of the House to think about this. I know my Right Honourable friend well, he has his reasons for bringing this amendment forward, but the consequence of it is that this House, at a moment when the nation is watching us to see what decision we will take about the deal that has been brought back from Brussels, this House today may decline to form an opinion. That is the consequence of passing the amendment, that we will today not decide whether we support this deal or not. And I put it to you, Mr. Speaker, indeed.
I'm extremely grateful.
Okay, so I've already covered Grayling not changing his vote.
That's my point. But the truth is that the public are saying to us, enough is enough. Get on, get out, so we can get ahead. It's as simple as that.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I absolutely agree with my right honourable friend, and that, to my mind, is the crux of the issue around this amendment today. Are we really going to say to the public today, we're not today going to make our minds up, we're going to yet again defer the decision? And every member will have to go back to their constituents and explain why today, in a moment that is the first Saturday sitting since 1982, we were not able to take a decision about whether we support the principle of this deal or not. I think that would be deeply damaging to our democracy. I think it would be deeply damaging to the reputation of this House and of every individual in this Parliament. And, Mr. Speaker, I strongly urge everyone here, whatever their views, whether they are for this deal, whether they're against this deal, let us not put ourselves in a position today where we're simply not taking a decision and saying to the public, do you know what, we'll put it off to another day. I do not think, Mr. Speaker, we can afford to do that. I urge everyone in this House not to allow that situation to happen.
I'm very grateful to the right honourable gentleman. Liz Kendall.
Mr. Speaker, the decision we make today will shape the future of our country for years to come. And in making that decision, three issues weigh most heavily on my mind. The first is the potential risks this deal poses to the future of the Union of the United Kingdom. We have heard many times already that the deal explicitly separates Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK, with a border down the Irish Sea and with Northern Ireland remaining part of the EU's trading system, something the Prime Minister promised he would never do. And these proposals, I fear, have a knock-on implications for Scotland's future relationship in the UK too. I fear that the deal is an open goal to the SNP and their bid for independence. We have already heard the argument that Northern Ireland voted to remain, they're still part of the EU with frictionless trade. Why shouldn't Scotland have that too? Mr. Speaker, I have always believed in the importance of unions, that we are stronger and have more power and control when we work together. I don't expect all honourable members opposite to share that most fundamental of Labour beliefs, but as members of the Conservative and Unionist Party, I find it very hard to believe they'd vote for a deal that could put the future of our union at risk. The deal also has potentially profound consequences for the future shape of our economy and public services, paving the way for the government to take England, Scotland and Wales out of the single market and customs union, the hardest of all hard Brexit, short of no deal, with all the risks that brings for manufacturing and services. And whatever the Prime Minister claims, there are no legal guarantees for workers' and consumers' rights and environmental standards. They can deny it till they're blue in the face, but we remember it was precisely in order to cut those rights and standards that Brexiteers argued for years that we should leave the EU. So they cannot convince us otherwise now. And to be honest, I wish honourable members opposite would just be honest and say we believe the future of the country is a low-tax, small-state, deregulated country. They've got a perfect right to think that, but they should have the guts to put that vision of Britain to the British people. Finally, Mr. Speaker, on the implications for our democracy, I know colleagues on both sides of the House understand the risks this deal poses to the Union and to our economy. But they believe the risks to our democracy of not voting for this deal are even worse. But the truth is, this deal is not what people were promised during the referendum. Neither will it get Brexit done. Far from it. We will have years more negotiations with another cliff edge at the end of the transition. I don't doubt that many people will be angry if this deal is voted down tonight, but we cannot put that back. We must put that back to the British people so they can decide, is this the future for the country that they want?
Mr. Dominic Grieve.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I share the view of my right honourable and learned friend, the member for Rushcliffe, that the deal that's being presented to us has many flaws. One of the principal flaws is that as a unionist, I think it does threaten the union of the United Kingdom very directly. Although I'm bound to have to also accept that I think Brexit generally threatens the union of the United Kingdom very directly, and I've never really seen an easy way of trying to resolve that and deliver Brexit at the same time. Secondly, although the deal is a matter on which I should congratulate my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, he negotiated it, he was unhappy with the earlier deal, and he now says he's satisfied with it. I remain of the view that if one looks at its detail in terms of the likely negotiating process that will have to take place next year, I am left in very serious doubt that it will in fact be possible to achieve a free trade agreement, and that therefore this House will be confronted in 12 months' time with very similar challenges to the ones that we face at present, and with deep economic consequences if we can't find a way through them. So I'm afraid I am not enthusiastic about the deal. I was listening to my right honourable friend, the member for Maidenhead, who's been very consistent in her view on the issue of Brexit. Namely, that for us as a House, or MPs, to both offer a referendum and then try to thwart it by our own actions or reject it is a con trick. And I don't disagree with her about that, although we have this disagreement, and if I don't believe that it is in any way a con trick, when one finds oneself ending up with something so utterly different from what was being offered, I don't see anything wrong in going back and asking the electorate whether that is what they really want. And I remain of the view that that possibility exists, and if it were to be a majority view of the House that it should be done, I would support it and seek to have that carried out, because I think the consequences are so momentous. But I'd also like to make clear to the Prime Minister that if that were to fail, I would not seek to oppose leaving on these terms. I want to make that quite clear. We've got to resolve this. But that then brings me to the amendment of my right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset. It is frankly extraordinary that a government that says it wants to follow a sensible process then seeks to railroad that process in a way that makes it likely that proper debate will not take place. And to that I profoundly object, and for that reason I will support that amendment, and anybody in this House who wants an orderly form of Brexit should do so as well.
Mr. Seirei.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I will be voting for the amendment of the Right Honourable Member for West Dorset because it is an insurance policy against no deal by accident or by design. What is very clear from the debate so far is this, that the deal the Prime Minister has brought back will give us less good access to our biggest, nearest and most important market than we enjoy today, and less good access to the deal negotiated by the former Prime Minister would have given, and I cannot understand why anyone should regard that as something to be celebrated, cheered or recommended. It is no wonder the government does not want to do an economic assessment, because it would show what the government's last economic assessment shows. And I thought it was very striking as my right honourable friend, in his typically forensic and eloquent way, told the House what it would mean in practice to watch the euphoria that was evident on the benches opposite earlier give way to cold realisation of what it will mean for the businesses and industries that we represent in our constituencies. And I simply ask the question, Mr. Speaker, why would we want to undermine our future economy, investment, opportunity and potential in this way? The second point I want to make is about consent. Because the Prime Minister was right in asking us how are we going to heal the rift that Brexit has created. If this deal is defeated today, it will be the fourth time in which the House has been unable to agree a way forward. And I am the first to admit that we cannot carry on like this. We need to find a way forward. And that is why a way of doing so has been offered in a very prescient intervention a year ago by my honourable friends, the members for Hove and Sedgefield, with their compromise proposal. And it is a compromise because there is in politics a division between those who advocate if we can't get a deal, we leave with no deal, and on the other hand, those who say, let's just cancel the result of the referendum, pretend it never happened. Now, I do not subscribe to either of those views. The compromise is to say there is a way in which we can get this done and achieve a decision, and that is by asking the British people. And at the heart of that question is this: do the British people have the right to change their minds? Now, I fear that some people who reject a referendum would cry, no, they don't. We had the one vote and that's it. I disagree with that view, because it is fundamental to our democracy that when the facts change, events change, or time passes, we should have the opportunity to change our minds if we wish. I do not know what the answer to that question is. The only people who know are the British people, and that is why I will vote for my honourable friend's amendment today, because I think we should ask the people what they now want.
Sir William Cash.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for me this has been really quite a long journey. I want to say very simply, and get it out of the way straight away, having given a great deal of consideration to all the issues that have been discussed over the last few weeks, and having had the opportunity to discuss with ministers and in Number 10 in various other places and in our groups and one thing and another, that I have come to the conclusion that we must support this deal. And I go further and say that one of the reasons why I believe it is so important, and I say this with great concern with respect to the DUP, because I know that there are elements about this deal which do fall short. And I'm going to say something else too, and that is that with regard to Article 4, I still regard that as a serious problem. But I am glad that the Prime Minister has responded, as he did today, with a personal assurance that he will ensure in the bill, when it comes, that parliamentary sovereignty will be recognised, notwithstanding, I use the word notwithstanding, the provisions that otherwise apply under the withdrawal agreement in Article 4, and furthermore, that he will also give us a guarantee that where vital interests of this country are affected, the European Scrutiny Committee will continue to have the opportunity to make sure that the House has the opportunity to consider and vote on questions which so arise. I won't enlarge on that now because that hasn't been entirely finalised. The bill has not been published, but I do say that there are signs of very great progress in that regard, because that is about the principle of sovereignty and the principle of consent. If the Select Committee procedures are followed along the lines that I am proposing, actually I also believe that Northern Ireland will benefit from that, because they themselves will be able to come into the committee proceedings and give evidence with regard to the manner in which this is operating for them, and then the matter could then, if all goes well, in terms of the bill itself, they will have the opportunity to have a vote on that on the floor of the House. Now, I am simply making that point clear now because I believe in the present circumstances this is a very, very historic moment, but it is a moment which we have to seize. So let us get out by the 31st of October, no second referendum, no revocation of Article 50, get Brexit done, let's have a general election, and let's sort this out once and for all.
House of McGovern.
Speaker, I want to say some words about the nature of the deal before us. And, Mr. Speaker, this is all a question of trust. Whether or not we should support this deal depends on trust. For the people of Northern Ireland, we have heard that they cannot trust this deal from their representatives today. This could take us backwards, not forwards, in Northern Ireland, Mr. Speaker. And we are learning about the Conservative and Unionist Party that before long they will be the party of only England. They are putting our union at risk. For the people of the GB Northern Ireland border, whether that's Birkenhead, Holyhead or Stranraer, they cannot trust this deal. And the Conservative Party is becoming only the party of the south of England. For the people, Mr. Speaker, of our manufacturing towns, we know the damage, as has been said by the member for Holborn and St Pancras and Francis O'Grady of the TUC, we know the damage that this deal will do to our manufacturing towns. And the Conservative Party is becoming only the party of the South East home counties. For Conservatives who want a soft Brexit, the member for Raleigh gave it away. The ERG have decided. So the Conservative Party is becoming only the party of the ERG, and this is their deal, Mr. Speaker. For the next generation, they cannot trust this deal on environmental protections. And the protests we have seen about climate change, those voices are not heard. On freedom of movement and on our rights at work, generations of trade unions cannot trust this deal. Now, we on the Labour Party benches here, we are representatives, not delegates. But I would challenge any Labour MP to disagree with the delegates of any trade union branch in this country. You cannot trust this deal. The Conservative Party is making itself untrustworthy, Mr. Speaker, because instead of rational policies, it's made itself a historical reenactment society seeking to undo 40 years of progress, of which they played a part. But their interpretation of our country's history is untrustworthy. And I want to mention one lesson from our history. When at the fall of the Battle of France, the Polish pilots who came to Britain to fight with us called Britain Last Hope Island. And then, as now, solidarity in Europe, not a Britain that stands alone, should be the source of our hope. That was true then, it's true now. This deal is bad for Britain and we should vote it down.
Dr. Liam Fox.
May I first say a word about the amendment? Those who are thinking of voting for this amendment tonight should not do under the illusion that it will take no deal off the table. No deal cannot be taken off the table. We can ask the EU for an extension. The EU do not need to grant an extension. The only way to take no deal off the table is to accept the only deal that is actually on offer. And the European Union. Mr. Speaker, there are three reasons why I think we should vote in favour of this deal today. The first is that it delivers on the referendum. And let's just go back to first principles. We made a contract with the people of the United Kingdom using the two elements of our constitution. Direct democracy, which said to them, we will not or cannot make a decision, therefore you must take the decision. And then using representative democracy to say, we, the House of Commons, will determine how to implement that decision. That is what we're being asked to do today. It is our duty to deliver on what we have promised the British people if we want to maintain faith in our electoral and political system itself. 80% of us on the Conservative and Labour benches stood on a manifesto that specifically said we would honour the result of the referendum. Yes. And it's not good enough to say that you actually favour a deal and then want to vote down every single detail of every single deal that is ever made. The public will regard it at best as disingenuous. When those then say to us, well, let's have another referendum, why would any citizen of this country, looking at their parliament that said we've been asked to have a referendum, vote in a second referendum if we failed to deliver on what we promised in the first one? This is a question of faith in our electoral system itself. The second reason, Mr. Speaker, why we should deliver on this is it gets us onto the territory of our future relationship itself. 3.5 years talking about the divorce and almost no time talking about the future relationship. There will be a great debate to be had about the level of alignment we have sector by sector with the European economy. That's why there is such a strong case for having a general election. Let's actually get out and make the case about what we believe in the future relationship. It also gives us the chance to help shape global trade policy in an independent trade policy at a time global trade is slowing down. And finally, it allows us to get onto other issues. So much of our political bandwidth has been taken up by Brexit that the public feel that we no longer talk about the issues that actually matter to them. Of course, there's no such thing as a perfect deal. I voted for the previous deal 3 times with strong reservations, and I've got strong reservations today. But it has come to the point where we have to deliver on the contract that we made with the people of Britain. It is time for us to put differences aside and put together the sort of stupid party political games we've had and actually do what we promised.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've reached the fork in the road. We must now choose. So do we choose the route that leads us to an outward-looking, confident nation, punching above its weight in a European Union battling for liberal values in a world that is increasingly illiberal, isolationist and belligerent? A course which guarantees that EU citizens, many of whom have lived here since the 60s and 70s, won't have to worry about proving they are entitled to health care, and provides for their UK counterparts in the EU who won't need to fret over what action to take should the time-limited 6 months healthcare guaranteed by our government expire? Or do we let ourselves be led by a colourful Pied Piper who chose his path and this deal, not out of any conviction that his path was just, rational or economically beneficial for our nation, but because he believed it was the most secure way of achieving his own ambition? Do we meekly follow a man whose excellent deal, according to such government analysis as they've been willing to make available, will leave each household at least £2,000 worse off and hit British jobs and living standards with the ferocity of the austerity triggered by the 2008 crash? This is a deal which, as the Prime Minister confirmed in his earlier rather rambling and dissembling contribution, may not survive the transition period and could still lead to a no-deal crash-out. Do we follow in the footsteps of a man who just a month ago, to a rapturous DUP gathering, claimed the precious union was in good shape, and a month later dealt the union a hammer blow which could shatter it within the space of just a couple of years? Are we so afraid of our shadow and lacking in confidence in our capacity to work the EU system to our advantage, as we have successfully done for decades, that we have to fall back on a nostalgic vision of empire and a buccaneering Britain? That is the choice in front of us today. I hope we will choose the former path. It would require one further step, a people's vote, to give the people the final say. That would be the democratic way, a way supported by the hundreds of thousands of people over there in Parliament Square as we speak. That is the only way of stopping the Brexit rot in its tracks and putting this issue to bed. I would urge all members to follow that path and vote for the amendment and reject this calamitous deal.
Antoinette Sandbach.
Mr. Speaker, I've always set out wanting to agree a deal with the EU that delivers the outcome of the referendum in the terms of the 2017 manifesto that I stood on. I fought against an undemocratic no deal and always voted for a deal In fact, I voted for a deal more times than the Prime Minister. I've even voted for a deal more times than the Home Secretary, the Foreign Secretary, the Transport Secretary and the Environment Secretary combined. Despite this, I've had the whip removed, and those who voted down deal after deal have been rewarded with jobs in the Cabinet. I'd like to support this deal as well, but the government have been sending mixed messages. Whilst ministers at the dispatch box say they want a deal, anonymous number 10 sources insist that they'll break the law and deliver no deal. Owing to this and the government's Janus-like ability to face in both directions, I cannot support the government without assurances. Those assurances come in the form of the amendment in the name of my right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset. This will ensure that the government and the members of my former party stick to their promises. It will also ensure that there's enough time to scrutinise the withdrawal agreement bill, which will likely remain a mammoth piece of legislation. The House may notice that I'm saying very little about the content of the deal. I was always taught that if you had nothing nice to say, say nothing. Suffice it to say, it is substantially worse than the deal negotiated by the Right Honourable Member from Maidenhead. And perhaps this deal's sole merit is to cast her redoubtable negotiating efforts in a more positive light. Hear, hear. And it is a great shame that opposition members of Parliament did not vote for that deal. Hear, hear. Indeed, the Foreign Secretary let the cat out of the bag yesterday when he said that this was a cracking deal for Northern Ireland because it will keep frictionless access to the single market. My residents and businesses in Cheshire would like that frictionless access to the single market. And if it's such a great deal for Northern Ireland, why can't my constituents have it too? So I will back the deal subject to the reassurance of the amendment, but I don't like the deal, and given the choice of a dodgy deal or remain, I suspect many constituents would opt for the latter. And as such, if I get an opportunity to vote on an amendment in respect of the people's vote, I will vote for that amendment too.
Liz Saville-Roberts. No, she's not in her place. I beg her pardon. I didn't intend any discourtesy to the honourable lady. Anna Soubry.
Mr. Speaker, on June the 26th, in 2016, we had a referendum, which was in effect a snapshot on a single day. A distorted photograph was obtained. It was distorted by false images. It was distorted by fibs on the bus, by fake promises of getting an easy, quick deal that would convey all the benefits of the free trade that our country has enjoyed for so many years as a member of the European Union. It was given and it was created by preying on people's fears and fuelling their prejudices at the same time. 3.5 years later, we now at least have some clarity. On 2 occasions, this government has negotiated a deal with the European Union. Now, I think, like the Honourable Lady has just said, that this is indeed a very bad deal for all the really good reasons that so many honourable and right honourable members have said. This place remains divided, and the answer is not yet another general election. The last general election didn't help us. It didn't solve anything because it can't. The only way now to solve this matter is to get it back where it began, in effect, which is to the people. To put that deal to a confirmatory referendum. Mr. Speaker, people are entitled to change their minds as the evidence changes and they now see with clarity what Brexit is all about. And our young people who weren't able to vote in 2016, they surely must now have the right to be a part and to determine their own futures, given that so many of them will be affected. No, I won't, we haven't got time. Will be so affected by Brexit. And it's right, too, that everybody, now that we know what it looks like, and this deal, by goodness, is such a bad deal. It's bad for the union, it's bad for jobs, and it undoubtedly opens a back door to the no deal that certain members of the Conservative Party undoubtedly want. And I gently say to honourable and right honourable colleagues opposite, how they can sit there claiming to be unionists and to vote for this deal defies belief. Mr. Speaker, what we need is a people's vote, and that's why over 1 million people today have come to London. Let's get it back to the British people. Let's get Brexit done, but by way of taking it back for that confirmatory referendum.
No. Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank all members of this House for their passionate contributions today. And I'd like to thank the Chancellor for the Duchy of Lancaster for sharing his mints earlier with the shadow front bench. But that's where my joviality ends, sadly, because today is a historic day. It's a day on which less than 650 people sat here now will agonise over whether they are about to make the right choice for their communities, industries and future generations. And today they ask themselves, is what is before us today truly a deal which protects and enhances their communities? And sadly, the simple and irreconcilable truth is that it does not. And as the Shadow Secretary of State responsible for business, energy and industrial strategy, I want to make it clear to this House, if agreed, this deal would be a disaster for this country and we must reject it. Mr. Speaker, on workers' rights, we simply cannot trust what the Prime Minister is saying. They say this deal protects workers, yet instead of strengthening protections, they have specifically changed the legally binding withdrawal agreement to remove any commitments on workers' rights. And I think it tells us something, that not a single trade union in this country, not a single one, backs this deal. The TUC say, and I quote, "This would be a disaster for working people." Unison have said it would risk every workplace right and leave public services exposed and vulnerable. While Unite say, by further diluting the legal protections for labour and environmental standards, the Prime Minister has made the laws that underpin workers' rights and public safety extremely vulnerable in future trade deals. Mr. Speaker, I could go on. But we should also look at the business case. Please forgive me for not giving way. We're extremely pushed for time. What does this deal mean for business? Put it simply, for business, for our industries and our manufacturing, it reduces access to the market of our biggest trade partner, threatening jobs up and down our country at a time when more investment is needed, not less. There is no economic impact assessment and no accompanying legal advice. Funny that, I wonder why. Because according to The Guardian, Britain is on course to sacrifice as much as 130 billion in lost GDP growth over the next 15 years if the Brexit deal goes ahead. And industry's been clear on this. It needs that market access. It needs a customs union to keep vital supply chains flowing. Yet this deal sells them out. No barrier-free access, no customs union. Instead, it puts the fantasy of chasing damaging trade deals with Donald Trump over the needs of our country. Again, Mr. Speaker, you don't have to take my word for it. Make UK, who represent British manufacturing, are clear. Commitments to the closest possible trading relationship in goods have gone. And that, Mr. Speaker, this deal will add cost and bureaucracy, and our companies will face a lack of clarity inhibiting investment and planning. Even the CBI have added the deal remains inadequate on services and that they have now serious concerns about the direction of the future UK-EU relationship. So this is a bad deal for industry, a bad deal for manufacturing and, more importantly, a bad deal for jobs. But, Mr. Speaker, let's look at what this deal will mean for the environment. Let's see what Green groups are saying about it. Greener UK, for instance. They've raised huge...
Order, there is an excessive noise in the chamber. It's very unfair on the Honourable Lady who's developing her contribution. Let's listen to each other courteously. Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Greener UK, for instance, they've raised huge concerns, saying environmental safeguards are absent from the new withdrawal agreement and that the toothless environment bill put forward by the government, and I quote, provides neither an enforcement body with independence nor a commitment to non-regression in domestic law. All at a time when we are facing a climate crisis across the world. This is simply not acceptable. And, Mr. Speaker, this government is asking us to simply trust them on all these issues, quite tellingly without setting out any detail or legislation today.
The Prime Minister says nobody in his government wants to reduce rights or standards in this country. Well, that is a remarkable statement, especially when you look at their track record. How can we trust them? Well, members on the opposite benches can cheer all they like, but how can we trust a Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy when she has made clear that for small businesses she envisages there being, and I quote, no regulation whatsoever, no minimum wage, no maternity or paternity rights, no unfair dismissal rights, no pension rights? How can we trust the Foreign Secretary, who wrote a pamphlet called Escaping the Straitjacket, which outlined his plans to cut workers' rights and regulations? And how can we trust the Prime Minister himself, who has said the UK should scrap the social chapter and has claimed the current weight of employment regulation is backbreaking? Mr. Speaker, the answer is we can't trust them. If their intentions were to maintain current standards, then why have they slashed every level playing field commitment in the withdrawal agreement? So, Mr. Speaker, we are about to make history. And in the final moments before we enter those lobbies, MPs will consider the weight placed upon their shoulders. Is this deal right for their communities, industries and future generations? No, it isn't. Agreeing this deal doesn't get Brexit done. Instead, it would sell out our country and sell out our communities, leaving us open to an onslaught of deregulation, reduction of rights, putting jobs at risk. And it's something no Labour MP nor any other MP worried about protecting their community could ever support.
Mr. Michael Gove.
Mr. Speaker, our democracy is a precious thing, and this Parliament is a special place. Our democracy depends on respect for difference, and this Parliament thrives on respecting the sincerity and the commitment to public service of every member. And that is why I know that deciding how to vote today for many members will have been difficult. And it is important that all of us recognise that for those who argued to remain, and still argue that that is the best outcome, they do so as patriots, but they take a different view from some of us. And for those who argued to leave, and have consistently argued that we should leave, and have argued for a better deal, we should all recognise that they are arguing for what they believe is best for our country. I respect those who have argued for both positions, but I respect most of all the many people in this House who argued that we should remain, who during the course of that campaign believed that it was the best course for the country, but who now recognise that the people having spoken, that verdict must be respected. And that is why, not yet, and that is why, in a debate characterised by many brilliant and passionate speeches, the speech that stood out for me was the speech by my right honourable friend, the member for Maidenhead. She argued for Remain. But she also recognised that when the people had spoken, their verdict had to be respected. And it is not just on our benches, it is on every bench. Members like the member for Great Grimsby, or the member for Don Valley, or for Rother Valley, they all argued that we should remain. But now they recognise that there is something more precious than being a leaver or a remainer. That is being a Democrat. What unites us in this House is that we are Democrats. And we voted in this House of Commons to have a referendum. We voted in this House of Commons to say that we would respect the verdict of the people. We voted overwhelmingly for Article 50, which honoured that referendum and said that we would leave. How will it look to those who sent us here now if we say to them, we made those sacred promises, but now we choose to dishonour them? Now, it is the case, I know that there will be individuals who will have specific qualms and concerns about this deal, and they exist all across this House. But it is also the case that the time has come for us to decide. None of us in a country that voted 52-48, none of us in a House of 650 members, none of us in a country of 65 million people can ensure that we have our own perfect Brexit. No. But what we can do is we can be prepared to put aside our perfect for the sake of the common good. And that is what the public want us to do now. In his speech, the member... No, I won't. In his speech, the member for Holborn and St Pancras laid out some of the concerns that he has about the political declaration. But he knows and we know that if we vote today for the deal, if we vote for this withdrawal agreement, we can then move on to ensure that the future economic partnership that we all want can be framed in the best interests of the British people. And we have given... I shan't give way to the honourable gentleman, but I'm grateful for his persistence. We can ensure...
Why am I... Sorry, I'm going around...
Mr. Michael Gove.
So when
Thank you very much,
a lot of my sources are coming in from Twitter. I look at like a lot of the commentators.
Every party in this
when I
house,
can,
every voice
it's
in
next
this
to
house
impossible,
will have
but when I
equal weight
can,
and equal value in making sure that
themselves
we
are
can
saying.
deliver a Brexit deal that delivers for the 52 and for the 48. That is our intention. And let me be clear, we on this side of the house, no I shan't and no I won't. However tempting it might be, I will decline on this occasion. Now, the truth is, because no deal can ever satisfy anyone, we could spend all our time
This is really strange. I'm seeing a lot of predictions saying
that position
the government needs a lot of Labour votes to switch
What would it
them.
look like to all those who have sent us here? What would it look like to the honourable lady's constituents who voted to
The
leave
margin
and
of
expected
last
that
time
vote
was
to be honoured?
58.
They
And
voted to put
there are
trust in this
28
place, to put
members,
trust
or
in
28
Parliament, to make
Spartans,
a
as
vital
called, members of
decision.
the RG,
If we duck that
MPs,
decision,
who are
if we
now
delay,
going
if
to
we
vote for
delay,
the government.
then I'm afraid
So that is
people will
equivalent
feel
of a
sense of depression and
56-point
dismay
swing.
and
It's to
demoralisation
minus
that the
2.
Parliament that they hoped would keep its promises has chosen once again to
Campbell
duck its
came out saying he
responsibilities.
would vote for it. That's -1.
I am clear also that everyone who has spoken in this debate has spoken
I
for the
see
best
where
of
it
Britons,
is.
including my right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset, a dear and old friend of mine. But one of the things that I would say to him and to others, and on that point I have to give up.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the chance of giving way. Everybody has their beliefs,
I've
and
counted
everybody does what they
Jenkins
believe
twice,
is
I
right,
think.
including our honourable friend, the member for West Dorset. If the bill that follows the meaningful vote were to fail, how would the government avoid
I've
no
counted
deal
Jenkins
before the end of
twice.
October?
One of the things that this government is absolutely committed to doing is making sure that we have a deal. And one of the things that we're also committed to doing is making sure that we obey the law. And one of the things that we're also committed to doing is making sure that we respect the voices of all of those in this House. Let me stay firmly from this dispatch box. This government is committed to ensuring that we have a deal. And the best way of getting that deal, leaving on October the 31st, and being able to move on to the other issues which the people in this country want us to discuss, is by accepting the honourable motives of the mover of the amendment, but recognising also that if we accept that amendment, we will not have a meaningful vote today. We will not unlock the door to our deal being passed. We will have voted, I'm afraid, in the terms of that motion, for more delay. And I'm afraid on that basis, I would urge everyone who wants us to honour the referendum mandate to recognise that that amendment, however sincerely it's been put, is unnecessary. What is necessary now is for us to reach a moment of decision. In the other place, Lord Judge, the leader of the crossbench peers, in some respects, the voice of moderation in that House explicitly said that the time is past for people to quibble and question the precise terms of this deal. He said, a former Lord Chief Justice, that Parliament needs to get on with it. Otherwise, there will be profound damage to public confidence in this place. And that is the question that every member of the House must ask. How will our constituents feel if tonight we vote to support this deal without the amendment? Our constituents will feel that a cloud has been lifted. That Parliament has listened to them with respect. that the vote in 2016 that we promised to honour has, after 3.5 years of deadlock and division, been honoured by a House that at last is ready to unite. And that is the choice that faces us all. Because if we don't vote for this deal unamended, then I'm afraid that all of those who send us here watching our deliberations will say that Parliament has failed to meet the moment. Parliament has failed to rise to the occasion. Parliament has failed to ensure that an important democratic vote, the most important vote with the greatest number of votes cast for any proposition in our history, will be delayed, will be dishonoured, and will not be delivered. And that is why I urge everyone in this House to recognise our first duty is to the principle that underpins this place.
Said no. The Right Honourable Gentleman is responding to the debate, and he will do so to a conclusion. Mr. Michael Gove.
Our first duty to our constituents and to our country is to keep our promises. This House said that we would honour that referendum mandate. The time has come. And the question that all of us must answer when we return to our constituencies is, did you vote to break the deadlock? Did you vote to end the division of these days? Did you vote to bring the country together? I know that members across this House will support the government this afternoon to do just that.
Speaker, sir, I beg to move that the questions...
Well, I am indeed putting the question. I'm extremely grateful. The question is that Amendment A be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. Division! Clear the lobby. You too. Order. The question is that Amendment A be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Tellers for the ayes, Thangham Debonair and Matt Weston. Tellers for the noes, Mr. Stuart Andrew,
and yes,
and
I
Mr.
am
Ian
indeed.
Stewart.
Oh my God, did I need that page? Possibly. No, they're not talking good. Okay, I misheard who the bloody tellers are.
Please of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Tellers for the ayes, Thangham Debonair and Matt Weston. Tellers for the noes, Mr. Stuart Andrew and Mr. Ian Stewart.
Gotcha. Phone's back so I can hear again. Sorry, I needed a photo on the thing. That is now done.
Lock the doors!
So I am back on here. Hello, people. Okay. Hurry up. I must need a pee. Passed, failed, what? Come on! Stand up in front of the damn box, will you? I think it's passed. The no tellers are out first, so... And now you get to see how I get my tweets out so quickly. I preload the, I pre-write the result ones. I just have to plug the numbers in. Come on, get those tellers out. You need to line up so I know which way this vote has gone. Come on. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So this is a vocal exercise just to help keep my voice up. Because obviously without it my voice tends to drop back down again. So this is very interesting. We have tellers. We have tellers. They're lining up. They're not lining up. They're chatting. She went to the no side of the box though. Ooh. Ooh, that's more than I was thinking.
Order! Order!
The ayes to the right, 322. The noes to the left, 306.
Thank you. The ayes to the right, 322. The noes to the left, 306. So the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Unlock. Order. The question is, colleagues, that the motion as amended be agreed to. As many as other opinions say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. We now come to motion number 2. I remind the House that I've selected the manuscript amendment in the name of Peter Carl and others. Minister or whip on duty to move formally. Not moved.
Shame.
Thank you. Order. Point of order, the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker. Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to you. I'm very grateful to the House of Commons staff, everybody who's put themselves out, everybody who's come to give up their time in this debate today. It's been a very important debate, an exceptional moment for our country, an exceptional moment for our Parliament. Alas, the opportunity to have a meaningful vote has effectively been passed up because the meaningful vote has been voided of meaning. But I wish the House to know that I'm not daunted or dismayed by this particular result, and I think it probably became likely once it was obvious that the amendment from my right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset, was going to remain on the order paper. I continue in the very strong belief that the best thing for the UK and for the whole of Europe is for us to leave with this new deal on October the 31st. And to anticipate the questions that are coming from the benches opposite, I will not negotiate a delay with the EU. And neither does the law compel me to do so. I will tell our friends and colleagues in the EU exactly what I have told everyone in the last 88 days that I've served as Prime Minister, that further delay would be bad for this country, bad for our European Union, and bad for democracy. So next week, the government will introduce the legislation needed for us to leave the EU with our new deal on October the 31st. And I hope that our European Union colleagues and friends will not be attracted, as benches opposite are, or rather I should say the front bench is, by delay. I don't think that they will be attracted by delay. And I hope that then, honourable members, faced with a choice of our new deal for the UK and the European Union, will change their minds, because it was pretty close today. I hope that they will change their minds and support this deal in overwhelming numbers. Since I became Prime Minister, I've said we must get on and get Brexit done on October the 31st so that this country can move on. Mr. Speaker, that policy remains unchanged. No delays, and I will continue to do all I can to get Brexit done on October the 31st, and I continue to commend this excellent deal, Mr. Speaker, to the House.
Point of order. Point of order, Mr. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome today's vote. Parliament has clearly spoken.
Order. Order. Apologies. The Prime Minister was heard. Yes, he was. Don't argue the toss with the chair. I'm telling you what the situation is, and everybody can detect. The Prime Minister was heard. and the Leader of the Opposition will be heard. It is as simple and unarguable as that. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome today's vote. It's an emphatic decision by this House that has declined to back the Prime Minister's deal today and clearly voted to stop a no-deal crash-out from the European Union. The Prime Minister must now comply with the law. He can no longer use the threat of a no-deal crash-out to blackmail members to support his sell-out deal. Labour is not prepared to sell out the communities that we represent. We're not prepared to sell out their future. And we believe that ultimately the people must have the final say on Brexit, which actually only the Labour Party is offering. Today is an historic day for Parliament because it said it will not be blackmailed by a Prime Minister who is apparently prepared once again to defy a law passed by this Parliament. I invite him to think very carefully about the remarks he just made about refusing, apparently, to apply for the extension which the EU No. 2 Act requires him to do.
Point of order, Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm most grateful. I think all of us in this House are aware of the responsibilities that we have. This is a crisis that we are in. And I'm thankful that the House has voted the way it has done on the amendment this afternoon. There is a clear expression from this House that we cannot crash out on the 31st of October. Mr. Speaker, I want to ask you what we can do to make sure that the Prime Minister respects the law of the land, that the Prime Minister respects the Benn Act and sends a letter to the European Council seeking that extension. And I wonder what we can do to make sure that the government does not bring forward a bill until that extension, as has been instructed, is delivered upon. And any failure of a Prime Minister who thinks he's above the law, well, Prime Minister, you'll find yourself in court.
I don't mean it in any spirit of discourtesy to the right honourable gentleman, but I think his contribution was rhetorical in the sense that I don't think he was particularly inviting my immediate response. If he was doing so, I would say to him that I think judicious consideration of these matters is always beneficial to colleagues across the House. Everybody, of course, must abide by the law. The right honourable gentleman is versatile, dexterous and experienced in the use of the parliamentary weaponry to try to ensure that his point of view prevails. So we'll leave it there for now. Point of order, Jo Swinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister's deal was a bad deal, and the public deserve to have the final say, not just the hundreds of thousands who are marching outside, but the millions of people across our country.
Order, I recognise there are very strongly held views on both sides of the House and on both sides of this debate. But the leader of the Liberal Democrats must be heard. And it is unconscionable if there is an attempt to stop someone being heard. Jo Swinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the people who are outside this building right now will be heard, and they deserve the final say, along with millions across the country. So the most urgent thing right now, Mr. Speaker, is that the Prime Minister complies with the law. And I ask your guidance. Would it be possible to suspend the sitting for a short time to allow the Prime Minister to go and send his letter and come back and make a statement to the House to confirm that he has done so?
I'm grateful to the honourable lady. It is not order. It is not my intention to suspend the sitting. The point will have been heard by the Prime Minister. I say to the honourable lady, all sorts of things are possible, but as to what is judged appropriate at this time, I think the puckish grin on the contours of the honourable lady's face suggests that she was making a point but not expecting such a decision. I'm grateful to her. Of course I will come to the... momentarily. Of course I will come to the honourable gentleman. A point of order, Sir Oliver Letwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I want to say first of all to the Prime Minister that I actually agreed with what he said at the end there, and that I'm absolutely certain he will comply with the law. I want to say to friends and colleagues across the House who helped us achieve this amendment, which I believe to be profoundly in the national interest, that I'm very grateful for that cooperation, but that our ways are now going to part. Because for many of us on these benches who have cooperated in preventing a no-deal exit by putting in place or helping to put in place the Ben Act and helping to keep its insurance policy in place today, now when the Prime Minister brings the withdrawal implementation bill to the House of Commons, we will be voting for it. We will continue to vote for it. We will seek to ensure that it becomes the law before the 31st of October, and if it does so become the law, this country will leave on the 31st of October, of hope that I share with the Prime Minister, but it will do so on the basis of knowing that should anything go wrong, we will not crash out without a deal on that day.
I'm most grateful to the right honourable gentleman, and so will many members of the House for the clarity of his exposition. No, well, people take their own view of it, but it's certainly clear and very pithy, and I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman. Point of order, Mr. Nigel Dodds.
Speaker, this decision now will give further time for detailed consideration of the bill when it comes forward. It will also give an opportunity to consider in detail whatever amendments come forward. It has the effect of not approving this deal today. And of course, we will examine all the details of the bill and all amendments in the light of our overriding concern about the constitutional economic integrity of the Union. That is our priority. It will remain our priority in the days ahead, and that is the basis on which we will now proceed in a timely and sensible manner.
I'm grateful. Our proceeding, I hope the honourable gentleman will take it in the right spirit. If, having known him for over 20 years, I say that I feel that our proceedings would not be complete without a point of order from the honourable gentleman, the member for Stone, the chair of the European Scrutiny Committee. Well, somebody is suggesting a division, but I will not allow a division on that matter. Point of order, Sir William Cash.
There is much talk about the law of the land. The law of the land, as it stands at this moment in time, is quite simple. Section 1 of the Withdrawal Act 2018 categorically states that the European Communities Act is repealed on exit day, which is the 31st of October, just in case anyone can't read.
Well, he's grateful, and I'm sure the House will be indebted to the honourable gentleman for his legal exegesis. There are other views on that matter, but the honourable gentleman has registered his with his customary force. Point of order, Joanna Cherry.
Mr. Speaker,
if members who are leaving the chamber, I understand the disappointment of the honourable and learned lady, but I cannot compel members to remain. I cannot, to coin a phrase, take anybody hostage. I do not have the power to incarcerate. So now I'm trying to be helpful to the honourable and learned lady. I'm playing for time. I'm playing for time. If members who, quite unaccountably, do not wish to listen to the honourable and learned lady would leave the chamber quickly and quietly, the rest of us, including assuredly the chair, wishing to hear the honourable lady, can do so. I think people are gradually beetling out of the chamber. If the chair of the Education Select Committee feels that he can beetle out and conduct his conversation outside, that will be very greatly appreciated by the chair. Thank you. Point of order, Joanna Cherry.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for your indulgence. Viewers in Scotland are accustomed to the sight of the Tory benches empty when speakers, members of Parliament representing Scottish seats get up, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing that in the SNP's party political broadcasts in the soon-to-come general election. But, Mr. Speaker, the point I want to make is an important one. The Prime Minister has failed to secure an approval of the withdrawal agreement today in terms of the Ben Act, and that means that under the law of this land he should be retreating to number 10 to pen a letter to the European Union in terms of the Act and in terms of the undertakings, as so described by the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, the undertakings that he gave to the Scottish Court. Fortunately, Mr. Speaker, we're back in court on Monday morning, and it will be possible then to secure the court's assistance if the Prime Minister has flouted the law and the promises he gave to the court. But, Mr. Speaker, can I ask this? Should Scotland's Supreme Court mandate you to sign the letter required by the Act on behalf of this Parliament, will you do so? Thank you.
I'm grateful to the honourable and learned lady. I have no expectation of being so asked, and moreover I have no aspirations to the exalted status that would have been attained by a person so requested or indeed directed by the court. But the short answer to the honourable and learned lady is that if I were instructed by this House, I would do as instructed, and if I were directed or instructed by a court, I would do as directed. That is my instinctive reaction. I would, of course, seek further and better particulars. I would take advice. But I repeat, I haven't been asked. I'm not expecting to be asked. I'm not looking to be asked. But I would do as I was required to do, and I would have no hesitation in so doing. Yes, indeed. Point of order, Caroline Lucas.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the vote on this amendment because it shows that a majority of this House have stood up for more democracy, not less. They've stood up for more scrutiny, not less, and they have also voted to rule out a disastrous no deal. But I believe it will also give us a chance, Mr. Speaker, to let the people have a final say, as they're demanding outside here now, over 1 million of them, demanding that right. The Prime Minister has changed his own mind more times than we can possibly count, most recently on the issue of the border in the Irish Sea. It cannot be right that the British people are the only ones who are not allowed to change their minds, and I look forward to the opportunity that this vote affords us to come back to put whatever deal is in front of us to that confirmatory ballot.
To the honourable lady for her point of order. I say to her publicly what I said to her privately, that I'm sorry that on account of constraints of time and a desire to bring matters to a conclusion, I was not able to call her today in the debate, but she has at least had a mini-speech in the form of her point of order, and I know that no power on earth would or should stop the honourable lady contributing frequently on future occasions, and I certainly look forward to that. Yes, very well. Point of order, Mr. Vernon Coker.
Mr. Speaker, is there any power that you have to enable this House and indeed the public to properly understand what the Prime Minister has actually just said to us? According to the law passed by this House, if a deal or no deal is not agreed, then there is a letter attached to that Act which the Prime Minister is required to send today, the 19th of October. Now, it may be my misunderstanding, Mr. Speaker, but I have no idea from what the Prime Minister said as to whether he's actually going to write and sign that letter or whether he's not going to do that. If he's not going to do it, Mr. Speaker, that means he is not complying with the law that has been passed by this House of Commons. Any of our constituents who don't comply with the law face the consequences. Is there anything that we can do to properly understand whether the Prime Minister intends to comply with the legislation and send a letter, or whether he's simply going to ignore it?
Well, my understanding, and I'm not a lawyer, I say that as a matter of some very considerable pride, is that the legal position is clear, and I don't dissent from what the honourable gentleman has just said about the legal position. Ministers have made, and I say this quite neutrally, a number of statements about adherence to or compliance with the so-called Ben Act. Those statements haven't always been immediately and obviously compatible with each other, I think we have to await the development of events. In general terms, it is of course true to say that ministers have emphasised their commitment to observe the law, including the Prime Minister has said that on a number of occasions. It is also true that the Prime Minister has indicated that he is not willing to seek an extension. My understanding of the legal position is the same as that of the honourable gentleman. I think that we must await the development of events. The honourable and learned lady from the Scottish National Party raised a similar concern about this matter. It has now been echoed by the honourable gentleman. Further enlightenment may follow when the Leader of the House uncoils, and addresses us from the dispatch box. I don't know. I'm not psychic. We shall see. But what I would say is I think that matters are coming to a conclusion today, but the House will sit on Monday, and I confidently anticipate that the honourable gentleman will be in his place and ready to leap to his feet with alacrity to advance his point of view and that of others. The honourable gentleman, Member Horsham, is shaking his head in a mildly eccentric manner. Not at me. Oh, indeed. Well, we're deeply grateful. I wasn't looking to call the honourable gentleman, though if he particularly wanted to raise a point of order, and especially as he used to be my constituent, far be it from me to deny him. Not today. OK, fair enough. I think a point of order, the Leader of the House. Point of order, Mr Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In the light of today's decision, I should like to inform the House that Monday's business will now be a debate on a motion relating to Section 13(1)(b) of the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018, and I shall make a further business statement on Monday.
Well, I note what the Leader has said, and we will hear what others have to say. Leader of the House. Point of order, Mr Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In the light of today's decision, I should like to inform the House that Monday's business will now be a debate on a motion relating to Section 13(1)(b) of the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018, and I shall make a further business statement on Monday.
Well, I note what the Leader has said, and we will hear what others have to say. And a point of order, and that's been done by the honourable gentleman on a point of order. On a point of order, the Shadow Leader of the House, Valerie Vaz.
Can I thank the Leader for making that point of order?
Jumping up, back up on the
Well,
stream.
I note what the honourable Leader said. Of course I'll come to the honourable gentleman. Point of order, Mr Pete Wishart.
I'm also grateful to the Leader of the House for announcing that additional piece of business on Monday, and I deeply share the concerns of the Honourable Lady when it comes to these issues. First of all, what's happening to the Queen's speech? What will now happen to the debates that's supposed to happen and the votes that we're going to be supposed to be concluding the Queen's speech on Tuesday and Wednesday? This is a huge discourtesy to the House. If the right honourable gentleman wanted a vote on this government's deal, he could have had it 20 minutes ago. That was the right time to do it. We deserve some sort of explanation as to why this is being brought back on Monday so quickly without any conversation or discussions across usual channels and no discussions and debate at all with other parties in this House. I think he has to get back to his feet and explain a little bit more about what he's intending and why he never took advantage of the opportunity to have a vote on this just 20 minutes ago.
Point of order, Mr Kevin Brennan.
And on a point of order, Mr Speaker, shouldn't the Leader have sought to make an emergency business statement if that is what his intention was, so that we could do just what the Shadow Leader from the SNP has done and my honourable friend has just done, and ask questions of the Leader as to his intentions for what's happening to the rest of the important business we have before us?
So to that is yes. The short answer to that is yes, and I intend no discourtesy to the Leader of the House. It had been intimated to me, albeit not by the right honourable gentleman, that in the event of the government being defeated on the Amendment A, it would be the Executive's intention to bring forward an emergency business statement. And although an emergency business statement is often narrow in its terms because it flows from a particular event on a given subject, it is susceptible of questioning. Whereas doing it on a point of order is most unusual and doesn't readily lend itself to questioning. And so, you know, it is, to be frank, unsatisfactory, but I don't intend any discourtesy to the leader, and I'm quite certain that he thought that he was doing the right thing. He wouldn't knowingly do the wrong thing, but I think it is less than helpful in terms of the exchanges. And I will have to take advice and reflect on these matters further, because I did not receive advance notification of any length of the intention, still less of the intention to do it in this way. Yes, I will come to the right honourable gentleman, of course. Point of order, Mrs. Helen Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, in the light of the very brief remarks from the Leader of the House, I wondered whether it had been made clear to you when the second reading of the bill, which the Prime Minister said would be introduced, will take place, and which days next week we will have for the 2 days to complete debate and vote on the Queen's speech. That's the question.
Well, it would be, of course, most useful to have clarification on that matter. The clerk at the table is waving in front of me, most helpfully, I hasten to add, a helpful wave as opposed to an unhelpful wave, notice of presentation of Bill, the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill, in the name of the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union. I heard also, as the Honourable Lady did, the Prime Minister refer to the government's intention to introduce the withdrawal and implementation bill. It is perfectly open to the government to do that. Indeed, it is perfectly open to the government to do that next week. And I had anticipated or surmised that that might be the likely course of action for the government to follow, which would be an entirely reasonable course of action, but I'm not at this stage receiving any explicit indication that that is what the government intends to do on Monday. And this doesn't altogether assist the House. Colleagues can reflect further on these matters. A point of order, Mr. Pat McFadden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a slightly odd situation because the question that I want to ask, I'd really like to ask to the Leader of the House, but because he's not made a business statement, he's made a point of order, I find myself having to put it to you. I am, of course, very welcome if he wants to get to his feet to help us clarify matters. What I think a lot of us want to know about Monday is it your understanding, as I have to say, that the government intends to bring back a motion to approve the agreement struck with the European Union under Section 13(1)(b), or is it your understanding that they intend to bring back the legislation implementing that agreement?
Well, as things stand, at 3:17 on Saturday afternoon, I have heard what the Right Honourable Gentleman has heard. The government seems to be planning to bring forward a vote under the relevant section of existing legislation rather than to bring forward the withdrawal and implementation bill. It is not for me to make the government's argument for it, and such an argument has not been advanced. It may be that they are thinking that the vote would be a different vote to that which has taken place today, and they may find reinforcement in that view from the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for West Dorset, to give but one example. But I repeat that an emergency business statement with greater clarity and the opportunity for interrogation would have been very considerably more helpful to the House. Point of order, Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As someone who's meant to lead for the Scottish National Party in the supposed Queen's Speech debate on the NHS and trade deals, I simply need to know, am I preparing a speech, as many other members across the House would? You know, there is work planned for Monday and Tuesday, and I think it's incredibly disrespectful that we simply don't know what we're doing on Monday.
I don't want to repeat the position over and over again. I've already indicated that the situation is obviously less than satisfactory, but, you know, I've got an enormous regard for the number and quality of the grey cells of the Honourable Lady. So it seems to me that if she is required at short notice to shift from the penning of one type of speech to the construction of another, and it will be, for her, the equivalent of swatting a hornet. It won't cause her any trouble at all. The point of order, Mary Cray.
Speaker, as the chair of our proceedings here today, can you tell us if it is in order for the government to put a motion before the House today which is effectively defeated and then to retable the exact same motion, hoping for a different result, perhaps in anticipation of certain conversations that may happen over the weekend between the Prime Minister and people who have voted one way, and then and perhaps on the basis of what may or may not appear in the Sunday papers? Is it in order to bring the same motion twice on consecutive days? Do we not have a duty to our constituents and to the country to let this matter rest?
I'm alert to the argument that the Honourable Lady has made. I think the fairest thing to say is, as I have been advised by the clerk, that a ruling on Monday on this matter would be sensible. I must say to colleagues that the Chair seeks to be as dexterous and versatile as possible in attending to colleagues' various points of view and in responding to questions put to the Chair. It cannot always be expected that the Chair will do so immediately when something is raised which had not previously been put to the Chair, of which therefore there was no advance notice, and which has not therefore been discussed with expert advisers. It's perfectly reasonable to seek that expert advice, to discuss it with those so advising, to reflect upon the matter in the cold light of day, and then to come back to the House with an informed as opposed to a speculative conclusion. Point of order, Mr. Martin Whitfield.
Very grateful, Mr. Speaker, and I'm cogent of your recent comments. It would seem to me that we had a business statement setting out what was going to happen next week in the normal way. That has now been altered on a point of order, and I'm not entirely personally convinced that that was an appropriate point of order. And if it wasn't, then we have not received notice in this House of what's going to happen on Monday. And my question to the Chair is, are the government able to alter the business on Monday using the method of a point of order, or should an invite not be made for an emergency motion that we could listen to and respond to?
I can put things on the order paper, but I repeat that this was not an emergency business statement. It could have been, but it wasn't. And that is a deeply relevant matter. So although the government can table that which it wishes, it can go to the table office and seek to table propositions, this is not an emergency business statement. And I'm not aware, there are precedents for most things in this House, and they're not for everything, but I can't recall readily an example of a business statement made purely on a point of order. I can recall that it's probably happened from time to time, but in any case, this isn't an emergency business statement as such. It is an indication of intent, but it's not an emergency business statement as such. Point of order, Hugh Gaffney.
Can you clarify, Mr. Speaker, that the amendments to the Queen's speech, which I have one for TV licence, will they still be considered on Monday, and will there be space in the timetable to hear those amendments?
Well, I certainly expect that the Queen's speech debate will be conducted, and it is to be expected that it will be continued. After all, the Leader of the House, who must have contemplated the possible scenarios, in all solemnity, informed the House on Thursday of the business for Monday and Tuesday, and he has not disavowed it. And the nod of the head from the Right Honourable Gentleman confirms that he is not disavowing the intention to continue with the Queen's speech. So I hope that the Honourable Gentleman derives some succour from that fact. It is necessary for him not only to listen to me, but to observe the head movements of the Right Honourable Gentleman Member for North East Somerset. Point of order, Mr David Linden.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. On a point of order, I seek your clarification on a procedural point. Quite clearly, the Leader of the House is not going to bring forward a business statement for the House, and it's quite clear from these proceedings that members wish to question the Leader of the House. Is there a provision within the standing orders to either suspend the House or give you an opportunity to consider an urgent question to the Leader of the House this afternoon in order that we might be able to question him?
Yeah, very good.
Urgent questions are not taken at this time, and I'm not sure that that will greatly advance matters. I will hear remaining points of order and will reflect on the other point that the honourable gentleman has made. A point of order, Kirsty Blackman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I've not been into the table office, but I understand that the orders of the day for Monday have been tabled and they don't, in fact, include the Queen's speech debate for Monday. So I'm not sure whether the Leader of the House's nod there meant that we would be having a Queen's speech debate on Monday or we wouldn't be having a Queen's speech on Monday, because the orders apparently just include debate on the European Withdrawal Act. Obviously, most of us have not had the chance to go to the table office and see this order paper. It would be very useful, Mr Speaker, if you could in some way compel the Leader of the House to stand up and tell us what that nod meant, whether we are having the Queen's speech debate on Monday or whether we're not having the Queen's speech on Monday, because the details that have been placed in the table office appear to say that we're not having the Queen's speech debate on Monday.
Helpful if the leader would elaborate. If the leader would care to come to the box and elaborate, I think that would be helpful, because at the moment there is extreme ambiguity about intention, and that, if I may very politely say to the leader, cannot be right. The leader.
Mr Speaker, I think you worry unduly that there will be a full emergency business statement on Monday, which is part of what I was saying, so that people will have a full appreciation of what business there will be. This was made on a point of order because the situation has arisen urgently, and it was important to make it clear to the House straight away what will happen. But as honourable and right honourable members will know, statements come very early in the day, and therefore there will be an opportunity for a full understanding of how business will develop. With regard to the Queen's speech debate, the Queen's speech debate will continue, but Monday will be as I set out on the point of order I raised a few moments ago.
It will be if it's orderly. It will be if it's orderly, and I will reflect upon that matter, and the government isn't the arbiter of what is orderly, as the right honourable gentleman knows, and as I indicated to him in the course of the exchanges on the business question on Thursday, and that is a matter that brooks of no contradiction whatsoever, even if people feel that they are immensely knowledgeable about procedure or have a right to have their own way, or both. They can do so only within the rules. Point of order, Mr Chris Leslie.
Speaker, further to what appears to be a sort of quasi-business statement from the Leader of the House, which was or wasn't, about matters that the House may be discussing on Monday, but we haven't had proper notice of, nor would we have had a day intervening of anything tabled today for discussion on Monday, which would be the normal course of events. The suggestion that we should repeat the same debate on essentially the same matter, section 13B motion, would surely be contrary to all of our normal practices, where the government of the day, if a matter has been disposed of, cannot repetitiously and vexatiously keep asking that same question until they get the answer that they prefer. So, Mr Speaker, I don't ask for you to rule on this matter now, but I would strongly urge you to take account of the fact that many of us would feel that this would be an abuse of the power of the executive, just because they didn't get the answer they wanted today, to come back on Monday and ask the same thing again.
Well, I concur with that sound advice from the clerk at the table. The honourable gentleman has made a good case, which should be duly considered. If I heard the honourable gentleman correctly, I think he said that he was not looking for me to make a definitive ruling from the chair now, and I'm most grateful to the honourable gentleman for that, because I'm not minded to do so. However, I say in all seriousness and candour to the honourable gentleman, again, that he has made a good case. I have heard his point. It has been amplified by many other colleagues, and I will reflect on it and give what I hope is a fully considered ruling on this matter on Monday. I will do so, of course, having taken advice in appropriate quarters. I hope that that is helpful to the honourable gentleman and indeed to the House. Point of order, Mr Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed. Mr Speaker, further to your response to the honourable member, and you're going to make a ruling on Monday, I'm just concerned if a Section 13(1)(b) motion were to be tabled for the House to consider on Monday, which seems to me to be what we've just chosen to amend today, that there would be an opportunity for an amendment or amendments to be placed down to it. And I mean, depending on when the government may table such a motion, could you give an indication whether you'd be willing to accept a manuscript amendment to it once we know what your ruling is on Monday?
Yes, it's draft.
I will, of course, I'll come to the right honourable gentleman. I think I can assure the right honourable gentleman on that point. My instinctive and unfailing approach, to the best of my limited ability, is to try to facilitate the House. It flows from that I do not want the House to be disadvantaged. In the ordinary course of events, one would hope that there was adequate notice of a motion and therefore an opportunity for amendments to be submitted on an earlier day. If there is no reasonable opportunity in this case, but there is, and I say but there is, it remains to be seen whether there is, an orderly motion before the House tabled at rather short notice, it must be right that there should be an opportunity for manuscript amendments to be tabled so that alternative propositions can be put before the House. So I think I can say without fear of contradiction that that would be the case. And it would be, I think, desirable in terms of processing these matters for any such amendments. If the government's motion has gone down today, a simple nod of the head would suffice. I'm grateful. And to be down, that such amendments to be down by midday on Monday. But, you know, I'm happy to hear other views about that, but that would be my instinct, that by midday would be helpful. But yes, there would be an opportunity for manuscript amendments. And, of course, point of order, Sir Oliver Letwin.
I'm very grateful to you, Mr Speaker. There are 2 points that I just want to put on record that may be worth considering when you're making your decision about whether this is an orderly proposal. The first is that, contrary to what one might assume, it is not the case that even if the Prime Minister has written his letter tonight, as I believe he now will and must, that this motion which the government has now put down is in a substantially different context, would have a substantially different effect from the one which they tried today, but which the House rejected. And the reason for that is that in the Benn Act, we provided very specifically that if there is a validation by the House through an approval of the withdrawal agreement subsequent to the depositing of the letter with the European Union, that letter can then automatically and immediately be withdrawn. So what the government is attempting in this motion to do is nothing more and nothing less than to repeat what would have been the effect of today on Monday. Secondly, I think it is important that the decision of the House today, when it passed the amendment and then subsequently passed the motion as amended, was specifically that the House was withholding approval unless and until the legislative stages of implementation had occurred. And this very clearly flies in the face of that, because it seeks the approval of the House without the legislative stages having been approved. Now, I understand entirely why the government is trying to do this, because, of course, it would negate the whole effect of the amendment today, rather than moving us on to the second reading of the withdrawal implementation bill, as I had hoped and expected. But I wanted to point those things out to you because I think it's material when deciding whether it's orderly.
Well, that's an extremely helpful series of points from the right honourable gentleman. I merely, in responding to the right honourable gentleman, repeat what others will have heard, namely that the Prime Minister himself talked about introducing the legislation. I cannot recall off the top of my head whether he referred to when that would happen. I don't know whether he said that it would be next week. but he certainly did indicate that that was the intention. So one deduced from that 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 was indeed what the government was proposing to do, rather than to introduce a motion under an earlier act. So that too is, in a sense, grist to the mill of the concern expressed by the honourable gentleman member for Gedling and by others. And it is most helpful of the right honourable gentleman to offer me his expert view in this public forum, the better to assist me in deliberating on this matter in the next couple of days. In fact, less than a couple of days. Thank you. Yes, I will come to the honourable gentleman. Point of order, Mr. Patrick Grady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The orders that are in the table, the orders that are in the table office that have been. I'm not really sure if I have a point of order to make now, to be honest, Mr. Speaker. The orders of the table office make no mention of the Queen's speech whatsoever, so I assume what the Leader of the House meant is that the Queen's speech debate will take place on other days. But what they do provide for is a motion under the terms of the European Withdrawal Act for up to 90 minutes, which of course means if there were no UQs or statements, we'd all be going home at 5 o'clock on Monday. Is there any way that the government can actually provide for more time for debate, given how heavily subscribed interest was, how many members, for very understandable reasons, were not able to be called today? What provision is there for the government to make more time available than just the statutory 90 minutes if we are to be having a meaningful vote on Monday?
People are bound by the standing order, but it's possible to put a business without motion down, but it would have to be done before the close of business today. I'm very sorry that the Leader has left. I know some colleagues are complaining about that, but you know, this is not a business statement or a business question. And indeed, I know colleagues are indicating from a sedentary position that they think it should be a business statement, and I had anticipated that it would be an emergency business statement, but it has not been. If it were a business statement or an emergency business statement, the Leader of the House would obviously stay throughout the exchanges, but it wasn't, and he hasn't. And colleagues must form their own view of that. Yes, of course, I'll come to other colleagues. Point of order, Mr. Stephen Doughty.
I apologise for not being in the chamber. I was watching on the television screens and I heard what you said about need to carefully consider this matter. I certainly only became aware of this myself just popping into the table office and seeing that something had been thrown down by the government in quite an odd move. And of course, Mr. Speaker, if they were trying again to put effectively the same question again, is it not the case that effectively, therefore, they are trying to avoid putting down the actual legislation, as the Prime Minister indicated he was going to put down, the actual withdrawal bill, which of course is what many members in this House of all sides and all views on Brexit actually wish to see, so that they can adequately consider it, that appropriate impact assessments can be undertaken, that committees like the committee chaired by my right honourable friend from Leeds can consider it, but also so that amendments to that bill itself can properly be considered and put down. And does it not strike you, Mr. Speaker, that that's a very odd way in which to be proceeding, given the clear will of the House expressed today on a very clear question?
Well, the honourable gentleman, I don't dissent from what he said. Whether the particular question that the government would be minded to table, or indeed has attempted to table, is exactly the same as that which was put today is less clear. The same question rule upon which I gave a ruling to the House on March the 18th this year holds, but whether this is the same question is not so clear, because the government would be wanting to put a proposition that was separate from the amendment in the name of the right honourable gentleman, the member for West Dorset. However, the apparent purpose of the said motion, which ministers are attempting to table, is to invalidate or obviate the effect of the decision that the House has reached today. And that does seem most curious and irregular. It is certainly to be expected that the government might seek to bring forward legislation, as the Prime Minister himself indicated to the House he intended to do. Quite at what point, I have, as people will know, been in the chair without interruption since 9:30, and I've not had conversations outside. It occurred to somebody to suggest that this motion would be tabled rather than legislation brought forward, I can have no way of knowing, because I have not been able to penetrate the inner recesses of ministerial minds. But I can only say that when I have reflected on this matter, I will give a full ruling, and I very, very, very politely reiterate that the government is not the arbiter of what is orderly. That cannot be so, and it is not so, and it will not be so. And there can be no argument about that. A point of order, Jonathan Ashworth.
I'm extremely grateful, Mr. Speaker. You've been very patient with the House. You will be aware that hitherto a regret motion to the gracious address had been tabled in the name of the Leader of the Opposition and myself about the future of the National Health Service and seeking to exempt the National Health Service from a trade deal with the United States. This regret motion has provoked considerable support in the country amongst NHS staff and patient groups, many of whom were going to a lot of trouble to come to the House on Monday to lobby members of Parliament ahead of that debate. Out of courtesy, can you tell me or tell the House what we should be telling to those NHS campaigners and whether or not they should come here on Monday, because it looks like the government is running scared of our debate on the NHS?
Well, it's not for me to advise people on their travel plans, but I do take very seriously what the Shadow Secretary of State has just said on that extremely important matter, about which not merely thousands or tens of thousands, but hundreds of thousands, indeed millions of people feel very, very strongly. And it would be most unfortunate if people who may not have that regular an interaction with or cause to pay visits to the House intend to visit the House, they are inconvenienced and disadvantaged with very little notice and without explanation, let alone apology. I cannot think that that conduces to the better reputation of the House. People will have to make their own judgment about whether to come, and the honourable gentleman will doubtless offer them his advice. But I think I have given colleagues an indication of my unhappiness with the procedure that has been adopted by representatives of the executive branch. And I will bear colleagues' concerns in mind in ruling on this matter on Monday. Yes, of course. Point of order, Sir Christopher Chope.
Mr. Speaker, do you think that this is an issue which should be referred to the Procedure Committee? Because it always used to be a convention that we had decent notice of the business that we were going to have. That convention has been, in a sense, undermined by the practice, which is more recent, that, for example, on a Standing Order 24 application, the debate is taken immediately after that application has been granted, rather than on the following day, which enables people to have notice. So we've got some dangerous precedents, might I say, of business being changed at very short notice to the detriment of members of this House and to members of the public who might want to come and attend our proceedings. And might I suggest that if this was referred to the Procedure Committee, then the Procedure Committee might be able to recommend some tightening of standing orders so that this sort of situation didn't arise again. And can I, while I'm on my feet, just say that it looks as though, from what the Leader of the House said on his point of order, that a motion has been put down on Monday under section 1301B, but that motion is not also going to be under section 11A of the 2019 Act, and therefore the motion we were debating today covered two different acts and two different provisions, but I understand that the motion down for debate on Monday is just on the 2018 Act. Therefore, it would seem, and I hope that you'll be able to consider this over the weekend, it would seem that it cannot be regarded as being the same as the issue that we dealt with today. So I hope that you'll be able to take those matters into account, Mr. Speaker.
Take the honourable gentleman, the member for Christchurch. I certainly will reflect on that point and the other points that he has made, and I take his points in the constructive spirit in which he's made them, and he speaks as someone who has been, of course, over a period, I'm not sure currently, a distinguished ornament of the Procedure Committee. And is the honourable gentleman currently gracing the committee with his presence?
Yes, if you put it in that way, I am. And I can say that I first had the privilege of joining the Procedure Committee back in 1984, when that Procedure Committee was graced with the presence of the Right Honourable Enoch Powell and many other distinguished members of this place.
I didn't know that. I knew quite a lot of things about the honourable gentleman, the member for Christchurch, but I didn't know that. But I am now better informed, and so I recognise that his service on that committee dates back a long way. I take very seriously what he says. I accept the point that he makes about the unpredictability spawned by, in my view, justified decisions in relation to Standing Order number 24, applications for debates. Nevertheless, it is a fact that that has inevitably produced a degree of unpredictability in the business. The only point that I would make, which I think is fair to make in this context, is that where we are dealing with applications under Standing Order number 24, there is an established process provided for by the standing orders, and it is understood by colleagues that an application can be heard only if the Speaker agrees to hear it, and can therefore proceed if the Speaker hears and approves it, only if the requisite threshold of support has been attained in the House. By contrast, in this particular case, a representative of the executive is seeking to change the business not on the basis of a voted for proposition, but on the basis of what some people might regard as an act of executive fiat. That does seem to me to put it in a somewhat different and perhaps inferior category. Well, the appetite of colleagues is insatiable. And I must say, by the way, at the moment, the very best behaved person here present is a very, very, very tiny person who seems blissfully unperturbed by our deliberations. And I wish that splendid little person all the best. Sweet. Point of order, Tom Brake.
I apologise perhaps if you have already made this clear, but is it your intention perhaps as the first piece of business on Monday to make a very clear statement about the process that we have just seen, particularly if you consider it to be of a vexatious and repetitive nature? And if it is appropriate, would you look very kindly on urgent questions on this subject, because members have clearly expressed some very strong views about what the government have just done.
It certainly would be my intention to make a statement on the matter after questions, after the ministerial question time. In other words, at or very close to 3:30. It seems to me to be a matter of genuine urgency, and therefore it would be right to have a decision on the matter communicated to the House before the House might treat of other questions or statements, and certainly before the commencement of public business. Point of order, Mrs. Marion Fellows.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be brief. Can you give me some guidance on how best I could register my disgust and disapproval of the behaviour of the Leader of the House when he walked out as my honourable friend, the member for Glasgow North, was trying to respond to a point of order made by the Leader of the House. This continues on for the behaviour of members opposite, who at every opportunity, barrack and shout down my group leader, the honourable member for Ross, Skye and Lochaber. This should not be allowed to continue, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to know what I can do to help it stop.
The honourable lady is invariably a helpful member of our flock in relation to these matters, because she's a model of good behaviour. And if her example were emulated across the House, our proceedings would be altogether more seemly. And her stock is high. So far as the leader is concerned, you know, colleagues have said what they've said, and I've said what I've said. I think it is very important that we respect each other, and part of respecting each other must be hearing each other. So far as her leader is concerned, and I did intervene, I think, on a number of occasions to indicate that the right honourable gentleman must be heard. I don't say this in any pejorative spirit to the honourable lady. My only caveat, if you will, is that the right honourable gentleman, the member for Ross Skye and Loch Harbour, is well able to look after himself. Moreover, there are colleagues who feel that the honourable gentleman has a rumbustious style which is sometimes almost calculated to inflame colleagues who disagree with him. And therefore, even if inadvertently, as the Minister says from a central position, and therefore to some extent, you know, he has to some extent, he has to cope with that which his style invites, but only to some extent, and it is important that he be heard, and I hope the Honourable Lady is happy to trust the Chair to protect him if he needs to be protected. And point of order, Catherine West.
Could you clarify whether it would be in order for the Leader of the House to apologise to backbench members who not only were expecting an explanation of some sort as to following the proceedings of today, but also for those who have prepared speeches for the Queen's speech and looking forward to giving those speeches and perhaps even polishing them as we speak, and not able to do that on Monday?
Leader of the House to do that if he so chose. He's not in the chamber now, and so even if he were minded to do so, and he may not feel so inclined, he could not do so at this moment. But the right honourable gentleman will doubtless be back in his place on Monday, as I'm sure the honourable lady will be in hers, and further exchanges on that matter and others can take place. Point of order, Susan Ellen-Jones.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. When the Leader of the House was not making his business statement earlier, we had no suggestion as to timings of anything that might happen in Monday's sittings. Now, we presume that the House will commence at 2:30 on Monday, but we have no idea of this as we're sitting today on a Saturday. So we are just presuming a lot of things and being left in the dark by a government, quite frankly, whose Leader of the House is not sufficiently courteous to make a business statement. Can you please clarify, Mr. Speaker, on the timings that we will be expecting on Monday?
The answer to the honourable lady is that I can assure her we